Right now, wherever you are, reach up and touch your hair. Go ahead. Feel it. Is it smooth and slippery, each strand falling straight down like a plumb line? Or does it bend, twist, coil back on itself? Maybe it does both, straight at the root, and then suddenly deciding to wave or kink halfway down. That texture you're feeling, that simple physical fact you probably don't think about most days, connects you to a story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. A story written in follicles and chromosomes and ancient skulls. A story that, incredibly, modern science still can't completely explain. Here's the thing that should blow your mind. Hair is everywhere. It's one of the most visible traits humans have. We see it, touch it, style it, obsess over it, spend billions on it every year. Walk down any street in any city and you'll see the whole spectrum. Poker straight black hair, tight coils, loose waves, everything in between. It's been this way forever. Egyptian mummies still have their hair. 3,000-year-old wigs preserved in tombs. Red-haired mummies from the Tarim Basin in western China. Their braids intact after 18 centuries in the desert sand. Hair survives. Hair tells stories. And yet, if you ask a geneticist today to give you the complete explanation for why one person has corkscrew curls and another has hair like silk thread, they can't do it. Not fully. They can point to a few genes, sure. They can show you the shape of a follicle under a microscope. But the whole picture, the complete genetic and evolutionary map of curly versus straight hair, is still being drawn. Think about that. We've sequenced the human genome. We've sent probes to the edge of the solar system. We can edit DNA and grow organs in labs. But something as everyday as the difference between curly and straight hair remains, in important ways, a mystery. Scientists know that a gene called EDAR is linked to the thick, straight hair common in East Asia. They know that a variant in a gene called TCSSRH helps explain some of the curl variation in Europeans. They know follicle shape matters. Round follicles tend to produce straight hair. Oval or asymmetrical ones produce curls. But here's what they also know. There are many additional genes involved, genes we haven't identified yet. And different populations can end up with similar hair textures through completely different genetic routes. The map is incomplete. The story is unfinished. And that's what makes this so fascinating. Because hair texture isn't some rare trait that only shows up in a handful of people. Recent surveys suggest that roughly half the people on Earth, maybe more, don't have straight hair. Around 11% have distinctly curly hair, not just wavy. In the United States, somewhere between 60 and 65% of people report having wavy, curly or coily hair. This is not an edge case. This is the human condition. We are a species of waves and coils and kinks, as much as we're a species of straight strands. Yet for a long time, science treated straight hair as the default and curls as the thing that needed explaining. So this is a journey into that explanation, or rather, into the search for it. We're going to travel from the microscopic world inside a single hair follicle, where keratin proteins cross-link and curves are born, all the way back to the African savannas hundreds of thousands of years ago, where our ancestors were evolving under a sun so fierce that the shape of their hair might have meant the difference between life and death. We're going to meet ancient Egyptians who smoothed their wigs with perfume gels made from beeswax and plant resins. We're going to walk the Silk Road with mummies whose hair still holds its colour. We're going to sit in modern DNA labs where researchers are trying to untangle the genetic threads that connect a baby born in Seoul with straight black hair to a baby born in Lagos with tight coils to a baby born in Athens with loose waves. And we're going to see how something as simple as hair became a battleground, a marker of identity, a source of pride and pain, a multi-billion-dollar industry, and a trait that children as young as 5 already understand carries social weight. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I made it. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I love reading them. São Paulo at midnight, London at breakfast, Tokyo on a lunch break. All of us, all over the world, connected by these stories, and by hair. Because no matter where you are, you have it. And the odds are decent that yours does something other than fall straight down. This is going to be a slow, winding exploration. We're not in a hurry. We're going to linger in the details, the weird gaps in knowledge, the competing theories, the moments when a 3,000-year-old wig teaches us something a genome can't. Because the story of curly versus straight hair is really the story of human diversity itself. How it arose, why it persists, what it means, and why, after all this time, we still don't have all the answers. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers themselves are surprising. Roughly 48% of people alive today do not have straight hair, nearly half the planet. In the United States, surveys suggest that somewhere between 54 and 65% of people have wavy, curly or coily textures. Straight hair is not the global default. It's not even the American default. Yet for most of modern history, scientific literature and popular culture treated it that way. Treated straightness as normal and everything else as variation. But when you actually look at the distribution of hair textures across the world, what you see is not a norm with exceptions. What you see is a patchwork. Start in sub-Saharan Africa. This is where the human story begins, and this is where you find the highest frequency and the widest variation of tightly coiled hair. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of people in many sub-Saharan populations have curly or coily textures. Not one type of curl. The range is enormous. Tight coils that spring back when pulled, looser spirals, Z-shaped kinks. The so-called Afro-textured hair that characterizes much of the African continent and the African diaspora represents not a single phenotype, but a spectrum of textures that all share one thing in common. They curve, they coil, they don't fall straight. Now move east, across the Indian Ocean to East Asia. Here the pattern flips. In populations across China, Japan, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia, straight hair dominates. Some estimates put the rate of naturally curly or wavy hair at only 10 to 20%. The hair is not just straight, it's often thick, round in cross-section, growing from follicles that are almost perfectly symmetrical. This is the hair type most strongly associated with a genetic variant called EDARV370A, a single mutation that shows up at very high frequency in East Asian and Native American populations. When scientists talk about a genetic signature for straight hair, this is what they mean. A variant that spread through specific populations, carried along by migration and perhaps selection, creating a visible pattern you can map across continents. But then you get to Europe, and the map gets messy. One synthesis suggests about 45% of Europeans have straight hair, 40% wavy, 15% curly. Another source says that in some European subpopulations, anywhere from 15 to 80% of people have wavy to loosely curled hair. 80%. That's not a minor variation. That's a fundamentally different picture depending on where you look and how you define the terms. Are we talking about hair that forms ringlets, or just hair that bends a little? The categories themselves start to blur, and Europe is a relatively small, well-studied region. Imagine trying to map the whole world. The Middle East and North Africa show similar complexity. Some compilations suggest that up to 80% of people in parts of West Asia and the Maghreb have loosely curly to coiled hair. Not tight coils like much of sub-Saharan Africa, but waves, loose spirals, textures that fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. This makes sense. These are regions that have been crossroads for millennia. Trade routes, migrations, empires rising and falling, genes flowing in every direction, hair texture following along, mixing, recombining, creating local patterns that reflect thousands of years of human movement. South Asia is another patchwork. Roughly 40 to 60% of people in southern India and some Southeast Asian coastal groups have wavy or curly hair. But the percentages shift dramatically as you move north or inland or between communities with different ancestral backgrounds. You can't draw clean lines, the borders are fuzzy. And then there's the Americas, where the numbers reflect the collision of three ancestral populations: Indigenous, European, African. Some estimates suggest around 45% of people across Latin America have curly or wavy hair. But that single number hides enormous regional variation. A person in Mexico City, another in Buenos Aires, another in the Amazon basin, they might all be counted in the same statistic, but their hair tells three completely different ancestral stories. Here's the thing that should make you pause. All these numbers, every percentage I just quoted, they're approximations. Rough estimates based on consumer surveys, marketing reports, non-random samples, not standardized anthropological measurements, not genetic censuses, just people answering questions about their own hair and companies trying to figure out how to sell them products. When you see a claim that 48% of the world has non-straight hair, or that 11% has distinctly curly hair, you're not looking at hard science. You're looking at educated guesswork, and the definitions are all over the place. One survey counts loose waves as curly, another reserves curly for tight spirals and calls everything else wavy or straight. A marketing report from a haircare company will use completely different categories than a genetics paper. So when different sources give you wildly different numbers, over a third of the world is curly in one estimate, 65% have textured hair in another. They're not necessarily contradicting each other, they're just measuring different things. This might seem like a minor point, but it's actually central to the mystery. We can't even agree on how to categorize the trait we're trying to explain. Is hair texture a spectrum or a set of discrete types? Are there three categories, straight, wavy, curly, or 4 or 7? Where do you draw the line between wavy and curly? Between curly and coily? Ask 10 people to classify the same head of hair and you'll get 10 different answers. But the fuzzy categories don't erase the broader patterns. Sub-Saharan Africa really does have the highest concentration of tightly coiled hair. East Asia really does show a strong signal for straight, thick strands. Europe, the Middle East, South Asia and the Americas really are mixed zones where multiple hair types appear in the same populations, sometimes in the same families. The map is real even if the borders are blurry, and what the map shows is this. Hair texture varies globally in ways that track, roughly, with ancestry and geography. But it doesn't track perfectly. It doesn't follow simple rules. You can't look at someone's hair and know exactly where their ancestors came from, because the same texture can arise from different genetic causes in different groups. The same climate can select for different solutions. The same migration can carry different variants to the same place. So here's the question the map leaves us with. If nearly half the world has hair that bends, waves, or coils, if the distribution spans every continent and every population, if the genetics are complex and polygenic and still being worked out, why does this trait show so much variation? What evolutionary forces pushed human hair in so many different directions? And why, after all this time, can't we fully explain something so visible, so universal, so seemingly simple? The answer lies deeper than the map. It lies inside the follicle, written in the architecture of a single strand. That's where we're going next. Here's what actually happens beneath your scalp, in the millimeters of living tissue you never think about. Every hair on your head begins in a follicle, a tiny pocket in the dermis, lined with specialized cells supplied by blood vessels and nerves, connected to a sebaceous gland that produces oil. At the base of this pocket sits a structure called the dermal papilla, a little cluster of connective tissue cells that acts like a control center. Above it, wrapped around it, are the matrix cells. These are the factories. They divide rapidly, producing daughter cells that fill up with a tough protein called keratin, then harden, flatten, and die. As they die, they stack up, push upward, and become the hair shaft. The strand you see, the curl or wave or straightness you style every morning, it was decided down there, in those few cubic millimeters at the bottom of the follicle, before the cells ever reach the surface. Here's the first key. The shape of the follicle determines the shape of the hair. If the follicle is round, perfectly cylindrical, oriented straight up and down in the skin, the hair that grows out of it will be round in cross-section, and it will emerge straight. The cells stack evenly. The keratin distributes symmetrically. There's no bias, no pressure to curve. But if the follicle is oval, or if it sits at an angle, or if the very bottom, the part where the hair bulb forms, has a slight hook or bend, then the hair has to curve as it grows. It's being pushed through an asymmetric channel. The result is a strand that emerges already bent, already set on a path to spiral or coil. This isn't speculation. You can see it under a microscope. Take a cross-section of a straight hair and it's nearly circular. Take a cross-section of a tightly coiled hair and it's flattened, elliptical, kidney-shaped. The geometry is built in from the start. The follicle is the mold, the hair is the cast, but the follicle shape is only part of the story. Because even if two follicles are the same shape, the hair they produce can curl differently depending on what's happening inside the strand itself. Inside the cortex, the thick middle layer that makes up most of the hair structure, keratin molecules are arranged into long rope-like bundles, microfibrils twisted into macrofibrils, all held together by chemical bonds. Some of these bonds are weak, hydrogen bonds that break and reform when the hair gets wet, which is why you can temporarily straighten curly hair with heat, or temporarily curl straight hair with rollers. But others are much stronger. Disulfide bonds, covalent links between sulfur atoms in the keratin proteins. These are the bonds that a permanent wave or a chemical relaxer has to break and reshape. They're structural, they're load-bearing, and here's the thing. If those bonds are distributed evenly across the hair shaft, the strand stays straight. But if there are more disulfide crosslinks on one side of the cortex than the other, that side contracts more tightly. It pulls. The other side, with fewer bonds, stretches. The result is a fibre that bends toward the tighter side as it grows, creating a curve. Over the length of the strand, that curve compounds. A slight bend becomes a wave. A stronger asymmetry becomes a spiral. An extreme difference becomes a tight coil that loops back on itself. Researchers have identified two types of cortical cells that seem to matter here, paracortical cells and orthocortical cells. They differ slightly in their keratin composition and how they pack together. In very straight hair, these cell types are mixed uniformly, or the hair is dominated by one type. In curly hair, the two types segregate. One side of the cortex is mostly paracortical. The other side is mostly orthocortical. The boundary between them runs along the length of the hair like a fault line, and that asymmetry is what drives the curl. It's elegant. It's mechanical. It's also still not completely understood. Scientists know the asymmetry correlates with curl, but they're still debating exactly how much of the curvature comes from the cell type distribution, how much comes from the disulfide bonding pattern, and how much comes from the follicle shape forcing the issue in the first place. Probably all three. Probably in different proportions depending on the individual. The hair shaft itself has 3 layers, though not every hair has all 3. The outermost layer is the cuticle, a shingle-like arrangement of overlapping keratinized cells that lie flat against the shaft, pointing from root to tip. The cuticle is protective. It's the armor. When it's smooth and intact, hair looks shiny because light reflects evenly off the surface. When it's damaged, lifted, or rough, the hair looks dull and feels coarse. Curly hair, especially tightly coiled hair, tends to have a rougher cuticle just because of geometry. Every twist and turn in the strand creates mechanical stress. The cuticle cells don't lie as flat. They catch on each other when you comb or brush. This makes curly hair more fragile, more prone to breakage at the points where the curve is tightest. Beneath the cuticle is the cortex, the thick middle zone I just described. This is where the strength and flexibility live. This is where the pigment granules sit, giving hair its colour. This is the part doing all the structural work. And in some hairs, particularly thick or coarse ones, there's a third layer at the very centre, the medulla. A loose, spongy core of cells with air pockets. Not every hair has a medulla. Fine hair often doesn't. Very blonde hair usually doesn't. And even in hair that does have one, its function is unclear. It might help with insulation. It might just be a byproduct of the hair's growth rate. Scientists don't really know. The medulla is one of those features that seems optional, which tells you it's probably not driving the curl. Now here's the paradox that makes all of this strange. Once the hair shaft emerges from the scalp, it's dead. Completely biologically dead. No blood supply, no nerves, no metabolism. You can cut it, burn it, dye it, and your body doesn't care because it's not alive. It's a corpse of keratinized cells, a structural remnant. Yet everything about that strand, its thickness, its colour, its curvature, its rate of growth, was determined by living cells at the base of the follicle. Cells you can't see and can't feel. Cells that are still down there right now, churning out the next millimetre of your hair while you listen to this. The hair is dead. The root is alive, and the living root controls everything. This creates an odd disconnect. You can't change the curl pattern of a hair that's already grown without physically or chemically altering its structure. But you can change the curl pattern of future hair by changing what's happening in the follicle. Through hormones, through nutrition, through aging, through factors scientists still don't fully understand. People report that their hair texture shifted after pregnancy, after puberty, after menopause, after recovering from illness. The follicle is responsive. The hair is not. One is dynamic, the other is fixed the moment it forms. And there's one more piece of biology that makes curly hair fundamentally different from straight hair, in a way that has nothing to do with genetics. Sebum, the oily secretion from the sebaceous gland attached to each follicle. Sebum coats the hair shaft, lubricates it, protects the cuticle from drying out and cracking, but sebum has to travel. It's produced at the scalp and it has to spread down the length of the strand by physically moving along the surface. On straight hair, this happens relatively easily. Gravity helps. The smooth, even surface helps. Sebum migrates from root to tip, coating the hair fairly uniformly. On curly hair, especially tightly coiled hair, sebum barely moves at all. It has to navigate every twist, every loop, every change in direction. It pulls near the scalp and never makes it to the ends. This is why curly hair tends to feel dry, look less shiny, break more easily at the tips. It's not getting the natural conditioning that straight hair gets automatically. The biology is working against it. So before we even talk about genes, before we ask why some populations have more curl and others less, we have to sit with this. The texture of your hair is written into the architecture of your follicle, into the asymmetry of keratin crosslinks inside the cortex, into the mechanical reality of how oil travels along a curved surface. It's structural, it's physical, it's determined in millimeters of living tissue that you will never see, producing strands of dead tissue that define how the world sees you. But if the follicle is the architect, something deeper is writing the blueprint. What tells the follicle what shape to build? What decides whether your cortex will have symmetric keratin or an asymmetric fault line running down its length? The answer is genetics, and the genetics are turning out to be far stranger and far less complete than anyone expected. So the follicle is the architect. The question is, what's writing the blueprint? The obvious answer is genes, your DNA, the instruction manual you inherited from your parents, half from each, shuffled and recombined in ways that make you slightly different from your siblings, but recognizably part of the same family. And for hair texture, that answer is mostly right. Hair curliness is one of the most strongly genetic visible traits we know of. Twin studies, the gold standard for teasing apart nature from nurture, have shown this again and again. Take identical twins who share essentially 100% of their DNA and measure the curl in their hair. Then do the same with fraternal twins, who share only about 50% of their variable genes, like any pair of siblings. Compare the two groups, and you can calculate how much of the variation in curliness comes from genetics versus environment. The answer, across multiple large studies involving thousands of European ancestry twins, comes out remarkably consistent. About 85 to 95%, genetically determined. If your hair is curly or straight or somewhere in between, the odds are overwhelming that it's because of your genes, not because of what you ate as a child or how much sun you got or how often your parents brushed it. That's a higher heritability than height, higher than body mass index, comparable to eye color. Hair texture is locked in, written deep, almost entirely immune to environmental tinkering. If there were a single gene for it, a simple, dominant recessive situation, like the textbook examples of Mendelian inheritance, we'd have figured this out decades ago. We'd know exactly which variant you carry. We'd be able to predict your child's hair texture with precision, but we can't. Because there isn't one gene, there are many, probably dozens, maybe more, and that's where the certainty starts to crack. Here's what we do know. There are a few genes that matter a lot in certain populations. One of them is called EDAR, ectodisplicin A receptor. It's part of a signaling pathway that affects the development of all sorts of ectodermal structures, hair follicles, sweat glands, teeth, even mammary glands. A particular variant of this gene, a single mutation called V370A, has risen to very high frequency in East Asian populations. In some groups, more than 90% of people carry at least one copy. And people who carry this variant tend to have very straight, very thick hair, the kind that's almost impossible to curl even with heat and chemicals, the kind that stands up stiffly when cut short. This variant also gives you more sweat glands, slightly different tooth morphology, and denser, more branched mammary ducts. It's pleiotropic, meaning one gene affecting multiple traits, and it's been under strong positive selection, meaning natural selection drove it to high frequency relatively recently in evolutionary time. Why? Nobody's completely sure. Theories range from better thermoregulation to sexual selection to pure genetic drift in small founding populations. But the effect on hair is undeniable. Another gene that matters in Asian populations is FGF2, fibroblast growth factor receptor 2. Variants in this gene are independently associated with increased hair thickness, again mostly studied in East Asian groups. Put EDAR and FGFR2 together, and you're starting to explain why so many people of East Asian ancestry have the straight, thick hair that's become almost stereotypical. But here's the thing. Those genes explain the trait in that population. They don't explain it everywhere. Move to Europe and the picture changes. The gene that shows up most consistently in European populations is TCHGH, trichohyalin. It's a structural protein that's expressed in the inner root sheath of the hair follicle, part of the apparatus that guides and shapes the growing hair. Common variants in TCHGH are strongly associated with whether your hair is straight, wavy, or curly. If you're of European descent and you have curly hair, odds are decent you're carrying particular versions of this gene. But here's the humbling part. TCHGH variants explain only about 6% of the variation in hair texture among Europeans. 6%. Even though hair curliness is 85 to 95% heritable, The single biggest known genetic contributor in Europeans accounts for a tiny sliver of that heritability. The rest is scattered across the genome, divided among many genes, each contributing a small effect, most of them still unidentified. This is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. Many genes, additive effects, no single master switch. And it's what makes the genetics of hair texture so frustratingly incomplete. We know the trait is almost entirely genetic. We know a handful of important genes, but we're still missing most of the puzzle. Medline Plus Genetics, one of the clearest and most careful sources of information on genetic traits, puts it plainly. Genes such as EDAR, FGFR2, and TCHH are associated with hair texture, but many additional genes that contribute to hair shape and thickness remain to be identified. Many additional genes, not one or two, many. And that's based on research done primarily in populations of European and East Asian ancestry. The genetic architecture of tightly coiled and highly textured hair, the hair most common in African and African diaspora populations, is even less well mapped. The studies haven't been done at the same scale. The funding hasn't followed. The reference genomes are biased. So for the very hair textures that are most distinctive, most varied, and evolutionarily oldest, we know the least. Here's where it gets weirder. The same visible phenotype, say, loose waves or medium curls, can arise from completely different genetic roots in different populations. This is called convergent evolution when it happens across species, and something similar happens within our species. Straight, thick hair in an East Asian individual might be driven primarily by EDAR and FGFR2. Straight hair in a European individual probably isn't. It might involve other variants in other genes, some overlapping, some completely distinct. Loose curls in someone of African descent might come from one set of genetic contributors. Loose curls in someone of mixed European and Asian ancestry might come from an entirely different set. The end result looks the same. The underlying genetics can be wildly different. This makes sense if you think about it. Human populations have been separated for tens of thousands of years, long enough for different mutations to arise and spread independently, long enough for natural selection or sexual selection to favor different solutions to the same adaptive challenge, or no adaptive challenge at all, just drift and founder effects and random chance-shaping gene frequencies. But it means that there's no single genetic map of hair texture. There are multiple maps, overlapping in some places, diverging in others, and most of them still blank. Then there are additional layers of complexity that researchers are only beginning to explore. Epigenetics, the chemical modifications to DNA that affect whether genes are turned on or off without changing the underlying sequence. Gene regulation, the complex dance of transcription factors and enhancers that control how much of a protein gets made and when. Hormones, which we know can shift hair texture at different life stages, pregnancy, puberty, menopause, but through mechanisms that are incompletely understood. All of these could be modulating the basic genetic blueprint, adding variability, adding responsiveness, making the follicle not just a passive executor of genetic instructions, but an active responder to internal and external signals. This is frontier science, the kind where researchers publish papers with more questions than answers, where every new technique, better sequencing, larger sample sizes, more diverse populations, opens up another layer of complexity instead of simplifying the picture. So here's where we stand. Hair texture is almost entirely genetic. We've identified a handful of important genes. We know the trait is polygenic and population-specific, and we're still missing most of it. The broad patterns are understood. Follicle shape matters, keratin asymmetry matters. Some genes clearly play major roles in some groups, but the detailed architecture, the full list of genes, the complete map from genotype to phenotype, that's still being written. Which means the question you started with, "Why is my hair curly or straight?" has an answer that's both simple and maddeningly incomplete. Because of your genes. Which genes? Many of them. How many, we don't know yet. And that not knowing, that gap between the high heritability and the limited genetic explanation, is one of the most interesting puzzles in human biology. A puzzle written in every follicle on your head. But if hair texture is 85 to 95% genetic, locked in by your DNA from the moment of conception, why does it sometimes change on you? Ask around. You'll find stories everywhere. The woman whose poker-straight hair turned wavy after her first pregnancy and never went back. The teenager whose soft childhood curls vanished during puberty, replaced by hair that hung limp and fine. The cancer survivor whose hair grew back after chemotherapy in tight spirals she'd never had before. So different she barely recognized it as her own. The person who hit menopause and watched their waves flatten year by year. Or the opposite. Someone whose straight hair developed unexpected kinks and coils in their 40s. These aren't rare anomalies. They're common enough that dermatologists and endocrinologists encounter them routinely. Common enough that most people know someone, or are someone, whose hair changed texture across a lifetime. If the genetics are fixed, what's shifting? The answer, still incompletely understood, involves hormones. Those chemical messengers circulating through your bloodstream, rising and falling with life stages, with health, with stress and medication, and the slow drift of aging. Hormones that can reach into the follicle and alter its behavior without changing a single letter of your DNA. Start with the hormones everyone knows about. Androgens, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, DHT. We usually associate these with male puberty, with deepening voices and facial hair, but they're present in everyone, just at different levels, and they act directly on hair follicles. Not all follicles respond the same way. On your scalp, high androgen levels can miniaturize follicles over time, the mechanism behind male pattern baldness. But in other regions, beard, chest, androgens do the opposite. They convert fine, nearly invisible vellus hairs into thick, pigmented terminal hairs. Same hormone, opposite effects depending on location. The follicles have androgen receptors embedded in their dermal papilla cells, the little cluster of cells at the base that orchestrates growth. When androgens bind to these receptors, they trigger changes in gene expression, altering the follicle's structure, its growth cycle, the type of hair it produces. Can androgens change the curvature of a hair shaft? The research suggests they can, though the mechanisms aren't fully mapped. What we know is that androgen exposure can alter the balance of cell division and differentiation in the follicle, potentially shifting its geometry. Make the follicle slightly more asymmetric and you get more curl. Straighten it out and you lose curl. Puberty, when androgen levels spike, is one of the most common times for hair texture to shift. Some kids lose their curls, others develop them. Both changes track with rising sex hormones, but exactly how and why it goes one direction versus the other in different individuals, that's still an open question. Then there are the other sex hormones, estradiol, estrogen, progesterone. These also act on hair follicles, though their effects are different and less well publicized. Estrogen tends to prolong the anagen phase, the active growth phase of the hair cycle, which is why pregnant women often report thicker, more lustrous hair. High estrogen levels keep more follicles in growth mode simultaneously. After childbirth, when estrogen levels crash, a large proportion of those follicles shift into the shedding phase all at once. The result is postpartum hair loss, a sudden thinning that can be alarming but is usually temporary. What gets less attention is that some women also report texture changes during and after pregnancy. Hair that was straight becoming wavy, wavy hair tightening into curls, or the reverse, curls relaxing into waves. The clinical literature acknowledges this but offers few detailed explanations, Likely it involves shifts in how the follicle itself is shaped and maintained, mediated by changing ratios of estrogen, progesterone, prolactin and other hormones surging through the system. Menopause brings another hormonal upheaval. Estrogen levels drop, androgen ratios shift. Some women find their hair becomes coarser, drier, harder to manage. Others report changes in wave or curl pattern, sometimes more, sometimes less. Again, the mechanisms are inferred rather than directly observed. Researchers know that follicles express estrogen receptors. They know that falling estrogen can alter sebum production, change the hair growth cycle, affect the diameter and structural properties of the hair shaft. But tracking exactly how these changes translate into more or less curvature, follicle by follicle, that's hard. Hair grows slowly. Follicles sit deep in the skin. Observing them over time in living humans without invasive biopsies is difficult. So much of what we understand comes from population-level patterns, from self-reports and clinical observations, rather than from controlled experiments on individual follicles. Thyroid hormones add another layer. The thyroid gland regulates metabolism, and hair follicles with their rapid cell division are acutely sensitive to thyroid function. Both hypothyroidism, too little thyroid hormone, and hyperthyroidism, too much, are associated with changes in hair quality. Hyperthyroid patients often report dry, coarse, brittle hair. Hyperthyroid patients may experience thinning and changes in texture. Treating the thyroid disorder sometimes reverses these changes, sometimes doesn't. The follicle can be remarkably plastic, responding to hormonal signals, but it can also get stuck in a new configuration, a kind of biological hysteresis, where the path back isn't the same as the path forward. Then there's chemotherapy. The drugs used to kill cancer cells target rapidly dividing cells, and hair follicles, because they are among the fastest dividing cells in the body, get hit hard. Hair falls out usually within a few weeks of starting treatment. That part is well known. What's less widely discussed is what happens when it grows back. Oncologists have documented this for years. Somewhere between 50 and 65% of patients, depending on the study and the drug regimen, report that their hair regrows with a different texture than before. Straight hair comes back curly. Curly hair comes back straight or even curlier. The colour can change too. Darker, lighter, more grey. These are called chemo curls, and they're so common there's a name for them. Why does this happen? The leading hypothesis is that chemotherapy damages the follicle structure itself. Not enough to kill it. Most follicles survive and restart the growth cycle within 6 weeks to a few months, but enough to alter its shape, its internal architecture. The cells that define whether the follicle is round or oval, symmetric or asymmetric, those cells get disrupted and then regenerate in a slightly different configuration. The result is a hair shaft with a different curvature than before. For many people, this change is temporary. Over the course of a year or two, the hair trends back toward its original texture. But not always. Some people's chemo curls are permanent, a lasting mark of what their body went through. What's remarkable about all these examples, puberty, pregnancy, menopause, thyroid disease, chemotherapy, is that they demonstrate something fundamental. Hair follicles are not static structures. They're dynamic, responsive, capable of changing their output even when the underlying genetic code hasn't changed at all. The same genome, the same person, can produce straight hair at age 8, wavy hair at 15, curly hair at 30, and loose waves at 50. The heritability is still high because the range of possible responses is genetically constrained. But within that range, there's plasticity, there's sensitivity to signals from the body's internal environment. Researchers are beginning to explore this plasticity at the molecular level. Studies culturing human hair follicles in the lab have shown that genetically identical follicles can respond differently to the same hormone, depending on subtle differences in their local environment or epigenetic state. This suggests that what looks like a fixed trait, curly or straight, is actually the result of an ongoing conversation between genes and signals, a developmental process that can be nudged in different directions at different times. So when someone tells you their hair changed after having a baby, or during cancer treatment, or just mysteriously in their 20s, they're not imagining it. They're experiencing one of the small mysteries nested inside the larger mystery of hair. A reminder that even our most permanent-seeming features are more fluid than they appear, that the strand growing from your scalp right now has its own history, shaped not just by the ancient genetic inheritance you carry, but by the particular hormonal weather you've been living through in recent months and years. Your hair has a timeline, not just evolutionary deep time, not just the cultural history of how it's been seen and styled, but a personal timeline, a chronicle of the shifts and stresses and milestones your body has passed through, written in keratin, curling or straightening in response to signals we're only beginning to decode. Keep going. 200 million years back, into a world of small nervous creatures living in the shadows of dinosaurs. Your hair story begins there. Early mammals were not the rulers of that world. They were tiny, mostly nocturnal, hunted by almost everything larger than a rat. What they had that reptiles didn't was a new kind of skin. Skin dotted with structures that would change the fate of their lineage. Hair follicles. At first, those follicles weren't about looking good. They were about staying alive. Hair trapped a thin layer of air next to the skin, helping these little warm-blooded bodies keep their temperature stable in cool night air. Whiskers along the snout acted like live antennae, picking up vibrations, helping them feel their way through dark burrows. Coats protected thin, vulnerable skin from scrapes, bites, and the environment. By the time true mammals really appear in the fossil record, sometime around 160 to 200 million years ago, hair is already there. Not an optional accessory, but a defining feature. A whole new way of being an animal. Warm-blooded, insulated, touch-sensitive. For tens of millions of years, that's the backdrop. Mammals diversify. Some lineages become aquatic and pare hair back. Others grow thick pelts, manes and quills. The basic toolkit, follicles, keratin, growth cycles, stays the same. What changes is how different species dial it up or down. Our own lineage, the primates, inherited that toolkit. Early primates were furry. If you imagine something like a modern lemur or small monkey, you're not far off. A body covered in visible hair wasn't a question. It was just the default setting. The strange thing is not that we have hair on our heads. The strange thing is that we lost almost all of it everywhere else. Humans are sometimes called the naked ape, but that phrase is a little misleading. Under a microscope, we're not actually missing follicles. Compared to chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, we have a similar density of hair follicles on much of the body. What changed is what those follicles produce. In chimps, many of them make thick, pigmented guard hairs that form a visible coat. In us, most of them make tiny, nearly invisible vellus hairs, soft, colourless threads that don't form a true fur. At the same time, another skin system was cranked up. Sweat glands. Humans have far more eccrine sweat glands than chimps or macaques, and we use them constantly. When you exert yourself, you don't pant like a dog. You drip. Your whole skin becomes a cooling surface. This combination, miniaturized body hair, supercharged sweating, seems to have evolved as our ancestors left the dense forest and spent more and more time in hot, open habitats. Walking upright under the sun, covering long distances, chasing and scavenging in the middle of the day when other predators rested. A thick fur coat would have been a liability. It traps heat. It makes it harder to dump excess warmth away from the brain. A mostly hairless, sweat-cooled skin turns that around. Bipedal posture exposes less surface directly to midday sun. A bare back and chest soaked in sweat become a giant evaporative cooler. You can keep walking and foraging long after furred animals need to stop and rest in the shade. Exactly when this transformation happened is still debated. Some models push major hair reduction back toward the early hominins several million years ago. Others place it later, closer to the emergence of Homo erectus, the long-distance walker and runner of our lineage. There is no single fossil that announces here is the first naked ape. We're piecing it together from comparative anatomy, from sweat glands, from genetics. There is, however, one part of the body that clearly didn't join the great shedding, the scalp. While hair across the body thinned and shrank, scalp hair did something else entirely. It stayed thick. It became capable of extraordinary length. A human head can grow strands that hang far past the waist, something almost no other primate can do. That's not an accident. It means the growth phase of scalp hair, the anagen phase, was stretched and extended far beyond the ancestral setting. Why protect the head while bearing the rest? One possibility is simple physics. The brain is a heat-sensitive organ sitting in a dark box of bone. On an open savanna, direct tropical sun beating on that box is dangerous. A dense, dark mat of hair acts like a shield, absorbing and scattering solar radiation before it reaches the scalp itself. At the same time, air can move through and around the strands, allowing sweat on the skin underneath to evaporate. It's like a built-in shade canopy. Recent modelling suggests that, in strong sun, a thick cap of hair can reduce how much heat the scalp absorbs, making it easier to keep the brain within safe limits on long, hot walks. Over many generations, any small genetic tweak that made hair on the head a better sun shield, longer, thicker, more persistent, would have helped its carrier survive and reproduce. Once you've got reliably long scalp hair, it can start doing other jobs too. It can signal age, nutrition, health. It can be braided, trimmed, adorned. It becomes a surface for culture. But that comes later. At first, it's just one more tool for staying alive under a new kind of sky. Notice the asymmetry here. Our lineage turned down body hair almost everywhere, turned up sweat, and then, against that nearly hairless background, kept one region richly coated and controllable. Long before there was curly versus straight, there was simply hair here, not there. How do we know any of this, when hair itself almost never fossilizes? Most of the time, we don't. The record is quiet. Keratin breaks down quickly after death. Millions of years of hominin evolution pass with almost no direct traces of what their coats looked like. So scientists use indirect clues. One of the strangest and most informative comes from tiny hitchhikers that depend on our hair: lice. Modern humans host several kinds of lice, including head lice and body lice. They're very closely related, but not identical. Genetic studies suggest these two lineages split sometime roughly between about 70,000 and 170,000 years ago. Why that matters is what body lice need in order to live. Unlike head lice, which cling to scalp hair, body lice live mostly in clothing, crawling onto the skin to feed. They don't do well without garments to hide in. Their divergence from head lice is a clue to when clothing became a stable, widespread part of human life. Somewhere in that window, our ancestors began wrapping themselves in animal skins or woven fibers so consistently that a new parasite niche opened up and then evolved its own species. By then, dense body hair was no longer the main shelter for lice. The old fur habitat had been reduced enough that lice followed us into our inventions instead. Genetics gives us another piece of the puzzle. When researchers compare the genomes of dozens of mammal species, they can see patterns in the DNA sequences that regulate hair growth. In lineages like whales, naked mole rats, and humans, Many hair-related genes and regulatory regions show signs of gradual degradation. Mutations that don't get weeded out because full-body fur is no longer essential. The machinery is still there, but it's running at a lower setting, or not at all, in some regions of the skin. Put all of this together, and a broad outline appears. Long before there were humans as we recognize them, hair evolved as insulation and sensor. Long before there was hair discrimination or shampoo, our branch of the primate tree thinned its body coat and leaned on sweat, adapting to open, hot landscapes. Across that transition, scalp hair stood out as special, retained, extended, elaborated. Somewhere within that long arc, within the last few 100,000 years at most, the finer details of scalp hair, its thickness, its growth patterns, its tendency to coil or lie flat, began to diverge between populations. Different environments, different climates, different social worlds, all tugged at the same basic system of follicles and keratin. But that somewhere is still a blur. Lice divergence can hint at when clothing made dense body hair obsolete. Skin and sweat anatomy can hint at when we first walked long distances under an unforgiving sun. Genomes can tell us which switches dimmed our fur. None of them yet can say, here is when the first tightly coiled hair appeared, or here is when a population evolved very straight, thick strands. We know that, by the time anatomically modern humans emerge around 300,000 years ago, our scalp hair is already exceptional among primates, capable of great length, growing in distinctive patterns across different lineages. We know that today textured hair, wavy, curly, coily, is common worldwide, not a rare exception, suggesting that variation is ancient, not recent. What we don't know is the exact sequence of steps that led from the general mammalian pelt to the specific spirals, waves, and sheets on modern human heads. That uncertainty is the quiet space at the center of this story, a gap between what we can infer and what we can prove, a reminder that, even with genomes and models and clever parasite detectives, much of hair's deepest history is still hidden. In the next part of this timeline, the picture sharpens just a little. We move from hair or no hair to a more specific question. Given a hot, open savanna and a vulnerable brain under the sun, what kind of scalp hair would help most? And why some researchers now think that the tightest coils, the hair often treated as most difficult in modern societies, may actually be the oldest, most deeply adapted form of human hair we have. Imagine one of those ancestors on the savannah, not the cartoon version with a club and a fur pelt, but a long-legged walker, skin mostly bare, moving slowly through shimmering heat. The sun isn't just above, it's everywhere, beating down on shoulders, reflecting off pale dust, radiating from rocks that have been cooking since sunrise. Inside the skull, a large, fragile brain is doing its quiet chemistry. It cannot overheat by more than a degree or two without consequence. But the cooling system that protects it, sweat, comes with its own cost. Every drop that evaporates is water lost. On a good day there will be another water hole, on a bad day there won't. In that setting, the question, what kind of hair grows on the scalp, stops being cosmetic and becomes survival engineering. This is where the savanna hypothesis for tightly coiled hair begins. The idea is simple on the surface. Tightly curled hair does not lie down like a smooth sheet. It springs away from the scalp, forming a kind of airy, three-dimensional mat. Strand crosses strand, creating a loose canopy. From the outside, under equatorial sun, it looks dense, almost opaque. From the inside, right at the level of the skin, there are tunnels and pockets of air. Anthropologist Tina Lassisi and her colleagues recently tried to test what that canopy actually does. They didn't have fossil hominins to experiment on, so they used the next best thing, a thermal mannequin in a wind tunnel. They shaved its plastic head, fitted it with different wigs, straight hair, moderately curled hair, tightly curled hair, all made from real human strands, and then blasted it with artificial sunlight and hot, dry air. What they found matches what that savanna ancestor would have felt, but in numbers. Any hair at all reduced how much direct solar heat reached the scalp compared to a bare head. But tightly curled hair did something extra. Under strong simulated sun, it produced the biggest drop in heat gain. The dense, springy coils blocked and scattered more radiation before it ever reached the skin. The helmet really did act like a helmet. There was a trade-off. A completely bald scalp sweating freely into moving air can theoretically dump heat very fast. Hair, any hair, gets in the way of that perfect evaporative cooling. The mannequin studies confirm this too. With hair, maximum possible sweat cooling is lower. But that isn't the relevant measure for a thirsty walker who can't refill a canteen at the end of the experiment. What matters is how much sweat you need to spend to avoid overheating in the first place. Here, tightly coiled hair won decisively. Because it blocked so much incoming solar energy, the scalp under tight curls needed far less sweat to stay in balance, no net heat gain, than the scalp under straight hair, or no hair at all. The shade canopy meant the cooling system didn't have to work as hard. Less water lost, more margin for long, dry hours between water holes. Nina Jablonski and others have described this as a thermoregulatory helmet. Not a solid shell, but a lofted layer of strands strong enough to shade, open enough to breathe. Solar radiation is intercepted at the level of the hair. Heat is dissipated there, out in the curls, rather than at the fragile skin. Meanwhile, sweat on the scalp can still evaporate through the gaps, especially when a breeze slides through. Now scale that up from one individual to a population. Generation after generation of people living in open, high UV landscapes, walking distances, carrying infants, foraging in the middle of the day when predators with heavy fur are hiding in the shade. In those conditions, any small mutation that makes scalp hair curl a little tighter, stand a little farther off the skin, create a bit more shadow, could pay off. A few more surviving children here, a few fewer heat stroke deaths there. Selection doesn't need drama. It works through small probabilities, patiently over thousands of years. By the time anatomically modern humans appear in Africa around 300,000 years ago, that process may already have had a long run. A 2024 review on the evolution of scalp hair takes this further. The authors argue that the ancestral condition for our species was not just hair on the head, but long, tightly curled hair on the head. Not loose waves, not straight sheets, but spirals dense enough to hold their volume even when completely soaked with sweat or rain. If you've ever seen straight hair when it's drenched, you know what happens. It clumps. It collapses against the scalp, forming a dark, heavy layer that can trap heat rather than block it. Tightly coiled hair behaves differently. Even wet, the coils maintain some of their spring. The canopy sags, but it doesn't disappear. Shade persists. In a hot, stormy savanna climate where heavy midday exertion and sudden downpours both occur, that matters. Long curly hair could keep shading the skull in all conditions, making it a more reliable part of the brain cooling system. Add another element, ultraviolet radiation. Equatorial Africa, where our species spent most of its early history, is a place of intense UV. Our ancestors' skin darkened under that assault, rich in melanin to absorb and scatter damaging rays. But the scalp, if fully exposed, is a weak point. Sunburn there isn't just painful. Over a lifetime it can damage DNA, increase the risk of skin cancers, and potentially affect folate levels, a nutrient important for reproduction and embryo development. Tightly coiled hair, lofted but dense, covers the scalp efficiently. Per unit length of hair, it can create more overlapping shadow than the straighter strands that lie flat and part easily. When you look down from above, less naked skin peeks through. Some researchers think this extra UV screening, layered on top of darkly pigmented skin, was part of what made coily hair advantageous. Thermal helmet, UV umbrella, water-saving shade. Put these pieces together and a picture emerges for humans living in open, high-sun environments, especially before clothing and hats were universal. Tightly coiled hair on the scalp may not have been a quirk. It may have been a deeply tuned adaptation. And because all living humans trace their ultimate ancestry back to African populations, some anthropologists now suggest that this coily protective hair might represent the original setting for our species. In this view, straighter and looser textures are later variations, tweaks that arose as groups moved into new climates where the old selective pressures weakened, changed, or even reversed. It's an elegant story. But like many elegant stories in evolution, it comes with complications. One is visible on any map of present-day hair. Not all African populations have the same texture. Some groups show very tight coils, others have looser curls, waves, or relatively straight strands. The continent that likely hosted the earliest evolution of coily hair now contains the widest range of hair morphologies on Earth. Another complication comes from outside Africa. Some non-African tropical populations, like certain Melanesian and island Southeast Asian groups, independently show tightly curled hair, despite quite different population histories. That pattern hints that similar environments can nudge hair in similar directions more than once. It also reminds us that genetic drift, random changes in small populations, and simple chance can scatter traits in ways that don't always line up neatly with climate. Then there is the human factor. Hair is not just biology, it's signal. Even in small bands, people notice and care about how others look. Preferences emerge. In some contexts, a certain kind of curl might become a marker of kin group, of status, of desirability. Individuals who happen to match those preferences might have more opportunities to pair and reproduce, independent of any thermoregulatory benefit. Over long spans of time, this kind of sexual selection can amplify or maintain traits that are only marginally helpful or even neutral from a survival standpoint. We see it in peacocks' tails, in elaborate antlers, in the complex plumage of birds of paradise. There is no reason to think human hair is exempt, so the savanna hypothesis does not stand alone, shouting, "This is the one true explanation." It sits among a cluster of ideas: climate and heat, UV and folate, water economy, chance, culture, preference. Each probably contributed some fraction of the final pattern. What makes the thermoregulation angle compelling is that for once, we can measure part of it. We can put wigs on a mannequin, dial up the artificial sun, and watch the numbers change. We can see that tightly curled hair demands the least sweat to keep a vulnerable scalp safe under harsh light. That doesn't prove ancient selection, but it does show a plausible path. What we still can't do is open a time capsule and look directly at the heads of Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens. Keratin doesn't preserve. Ancient DNA, powerful as it is, has not yet given us a clear, direct readout of hair texture in deep time. The thermoregulatory helmet stays for now in the realm of informed inference. But it does flip a common modern script. In many societies today, the tightest coils are treated as most difficult, most in need of taming, stretching, straightening. The hair that may once have been a finely tuned adaptation to one of the harshest environments on Earth is now, in some contexts, labelled unprofessional or unruly. If the savanna hypothesis is even partly right, then those tight spirals are not an inconvenience. They are a record, a living trace of the moment our ancestors left the forest, stripped down their fur, turned up their sweat, and solved the problem of keeping a growing brain cool under a new kind of sky. From that starting point, you can ask another question. If tightly coiled hair was so well suited to the tropical savanna, what happened when some of those descendants walked the other way, out of Africa, into cooler, dimmer worlds of cloud and ice? What happens to a sun helmet when the main problem is not getting too hot, but staying warm? That transition, the spread into new climates, and the surprising genetics that may have reshaped hair along the way, is where the story turns next. The sun was lower, the seasons sharper. Days could still be hot, but nights bit through thin clothing. In winter, light slanted weakly through clouds, dragging long shadows across snow and steppe. Ultraviolet radiation, once relentless, now came in pulses, strong in summer, scarce in winter. A thermoregulatory helmet built for equatorial noon was suddenly playing an away game. In these new latitudes, bodies that had been tuned for shedding heat and blocking UV now had to keep it, and squeeze every bit of vitamin D they could from weakened light. Skin, sweat glands, body shape, metabolism, all came under a new pattern of selection. Somewhere in that shifting landscape, hair was pulled along. You can think of it as an evolutionary trade. Near the equator, the priorities were: don't fry the brain, don't waste water, don't let UV rip up your DNA. In higher latitudes, the list shifts. Don't lose too much heat to cold air, don't let extremities freeze, don't starve bones and immune cells of vitamin D during long, dim winters. Straight away, another complication. The groups leaving Africa were not a single uniform wave. Over tens of thousands of years, small bands moved out at different times, by different routes, settling in places that were cold and dry, others that were cold and wet, others that cycled between brutal winters and mild summers. The selective pressures were not a simple on-off switch. They were a patchwork. Somewhere in that patchwork, in what is now East Asia, a tiny mutation appeared in a gene called EDAR. EDAR already had an important job. It helps guide the development of structures that form from the outer layer of the embryo. Hair follicles, sweat glands, teeth, certain glands in the breast. Change EDAR, and you don't just tweak one feature. You nudge an entire developmental program. One particular change in this gene, often called EDAR370A, did something striking. In people who carry it, hair shafts tend to grow thicker, with more uniform cross-sections, straighter. The follicles that give rise to those hairs are subtly different in shape and activity. The same variant also increases the number of tiny sweat glands in the skin. It alters the way mammary glands branch. It changes the shape of the front teeth, giving them a shovel-shaped cross-section that dentists can still spot today. All of that from a single letter change in the DNA code. In living humans, this EDAR variant is now very common across East Asia, from northern China down into parts of Southeast Asia, and in many indigenous populations of the Americas. In some groups it borders on universal. In Europe and most of Africa, by contrast, it's rare, almost absent. When geneticists scan the genome looking for signs of past natural selection, regions where a particular version of a gene has swept through a population faster than chance would allow, EDAR 370A lights up like a beacon. It carries one of the strongest signals we've ever seen. Somewhere between about 30,000 and 65,000 years ago, by most estimates, carriers of this variant began to thrive in East Asian populations. Their descendants multiplied. With each generation, the 370A version became more common. By the time the last ice age reached its height, the allele had gone from a tiny experimental change to a defining feature of entire regions. But why? Here, the story splinters into possibilities. One thread follows the cold. Thicker, straighter hair lies flatter against the scalp than lofty coils. Bundle enough of those strands together, and you get a dense sheet with fewer air gaps. In a cold, windy climate, such a layer could reduce convective heat loss from the head. Where the savanna helmet was about shade and airflow, the Ice Age sheet might have been about insulation and protection from dry, abrasive air. Another thread follows vitamin D. In low UV environments, getting enough vitamin D from sun alone becomes hard, especially through darker skin. Some researchers have proposed that the EDAR variant may have improved the composition of breast milk, making it richer in certain fats or vitamin D-related compounds. That would mean infants with mothers carrying 370A had a survival advantage in dim northern winters, better bone development, stronger immunity, even if the hair change itself was secondary. A third possibility looks sideways, at skin and sweat glands. EDAR 370A increases the number of eccrine sweat glands. That sounds like a hot climate trait, but glands do more than produce sweat. They help lubricate and protect skin in cold, dry conditions. More glands might have meant skin that cracked less in freezing winds, fewer infections, better barrier function. Again, hair thickness could be a hitchhiker, rising in frequency because of advantages in another system entirely. And then there is the oldest wildcard in evolution, preference. Thick, glossy sheets of straight hair are visually distinctive. In small Ice Age societies, they might have become a marker of group membership, of beauty, of health. If, for cultural or aesthetic reasons, people with this trait were slightly more likely to find partners or have more children, the allele would spread, even if its practical survival benefits were modest. None of these hypotheses has been crowned the winner. When researchers model the spread of EDAR 370A, several scenarios fit the data. The timing matches the occupation of colder, cloudier landscapes, but the exact selective pressure that did the heavy lifting remains unsettled. Hair alone probably wasn't the target. EDAR's influence on sweat glands, teeth and mammary tissue suggests a more complex package of traits under selection, with hair along for the ride. What we can say with some confidence is that this East Asian pattern, very thick, often very straight hair, is not an ancient human default. It's a relatively recent, region-specific reshaping of the ancestral condition. Europe tells a different version of the story. There, the EDAR 370A variant never became common, yet Europe today shows a wide spectrum of hair textures, from very straight to loose waves to tight curls, often within a single family. Genetic studies point to a different cast of characters. One of the key genes is called TCHH, short for trichohyalin. It helps cross-link keratin inside the hair shaft and in the inner root sheath of the follicle, affecting how rigid or flexible the growing hair becomes. Certain versions of TCHH are associated with straighter hair in Europeans, others lean toward wave and curl. There are additional players, genes involved in the shape of the follicle, the growth cycle, the distribution of keratin, but they don't map neatly onto the East Asian pattern. Many of the European variants are rare or absent in East Asians. Some are missing in Africans. Instead of one big sweep like EDAR, Europe shows a mosaic of alleles, interacting to produce that familiar range from poker straight to spiraled ringlets. When researchers looked at admixed populations such as the Uyghurs of Western China, who carry ancestry from both East Asia and Europe, they saw something telling. EDAR, variants from the East Asian side, and TCHH, variants from the European side, both influenced hair straightness. But they did so independently. No interaction, no shared pathway. Two genetic solutions nudging hair towards similar outward appearances. This is convergent evolution in miniature. Different starting points, different mutations, different histories, yet hair that, to the casual eye, can look broadly straight, in both a northern Chinese farmer and a Scandinavian fisherman. Flip the comparison, and the opposite also happens. Similar climates do not guarantee similar hair. Indigenous Siberian groups, some European populations, and some Northeast Asian populations all live in cold, seasonal environments, but their hair textures are not identical. Convergence is partial, not perfect. Here, the map of hair becomes a quiet argument against simple stories. The environment matters, genes matter. But the path from climate to curl is not a straight line. It's a tangle of local histories, chance-founder events, interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and shifting cultural tastes. Ancient DNA promised for a moment to cut through that tangle. If we can pull genomes from 30,000-year-old bones, can't we just read off the hair type, the way we now read eye colour or broad skin tone sometimes, but not with the precision you might expect? We can scan ancient genomes for alleles like EDAR370A or particular TCHH variants and say, this individual probably had thicker hair than their peers, or this population likely had a higher proportion of straighter hair. For recent time periods and well-preserved samples, there are tools that can give us probabilities for straight versus wavy versus curly. What we cannot yet do is reconstruct the full spectrum of ancestral textures. We cannot look at a Denisovan genome and see the exact coil pattern on their head. We cannot open a grave on the Mammoth Steppe, sequence a few teeth, and know whether the person buried there had softly bending waves or tight corkscrews. Hair curvature is highly heritable, but it's also polygenic. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of variants each contribute small effects, and those effects vary by population. Many of those variants remain unmapped. Ancient DNA is often fragmented, low coverage, missing pieces of the genome we'd need for fine-grained predictions. So when we imagine the first modern humans moving across Eurasia, we do so in outline, not in portrait. We can say that in East Asia, a powerful sweep on EDAR helped favour thicker, straighter hair for reasons we're still debating. In Europe, different genes, especially TCHH, carved their own path towards straightness and wave. In both regions, some of the selective pressures likely came from climate and light. Others may have come from the more mysterious terrain of human preference. We can't yet watch, in detail, how the savannah helmet unwound into sheets and ripples and straight falls of hair. What we can see, even through the fog, is that there was no single, global straightening event. No universal moment when humans decided collectively to trade coils for smooth strands. Instead, multiple experiments unfolded in parallel, in different corners of the world, producing superficially similar results through distinct genetic routes. The curls and straight lengths on modern heads are echoes of those experiments. Some trace back to a mutation in a small East Asian group huddled against Ice Age winds, some to slow shifts in European populations as they cycle through glacial and interglacial climates. Some never left Africa at all, arising in situ under local conditions we still don't fully understand. To see them more clearly, we have to turn from genes to the rare, fragile places where hair itself survives time. Places where the dead, wrapped or frozen or dried, still carry their final haircut into the present. That is where the story goes next. Hair is not supposed to be here. Bones, teeth, stone, pottery. Those are the things evolution and geology have agreed to keep. Soft tissue is meant to go back to the earth. Muscles slip away. Organs liquefy. Skin collapses. The details that make a living face recognizable usually vanish long before archaeologists arrive. Hair is the exception that keeps refusing to rot. Keratin, the protein that makes up each strand, is stubborn. It resists bacteria. It shrugs off many of the chemical reactions that tear other tissues apart. Give it the right conditions: bone-dry desert, deep cold, oxygen-starved bogs, smoke and heat from a careful fire, or deliberate mummification, and hair can hold its shape for thousands of years. Sometimes even eyelashes survive. For a question like ours, when did humans start diverging into different hair textures? That stubbornness is a gift, because every now and then, across that vast, mostly invisible film of human history, a single frame survives. A person, frozen at the moment of burial, still wearing their hair. One of the strangest of those frames lies in the Tarim Basin, at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert in what is now Xinjiang, western China. Imagine an environment so dry that whole bodies can dehydrate before they decompose. Sand, salt, thin air, no insects, almost no microbes. It is an accidental laboratory for preservation. In this laboratory, around 4,000 years ago, people began to bury their dead. They left behind the Princess of Xiaohe, a woman interred around 1800 BCE. When her grave was opened in the 21st century, she was lying in a boat-shaped coffin, wrapped in wool and leather. Her skin had darkened and tightened with age, but her hair was still there, a curtain of reddish-brown strands framing her face. Even her eyelashes clung to the lids. You can see individual fibres, the way they clump where ancient oils once held them together. Nearby, another body, now called the Beauty of Lulon, had met the same desert alchemy. She is older, perhaps 2000 BCE. Her facial features are delicate, her cheeks hollowed by time, but the hair at her temples and crown remains brownish and fine, still parted where living fingers once arranged it. Salt from a nearby lake helped desiccate her quickly, turning her into a meticulous record. Across the Tarim cemeteries this pattern repeats. Long braids, loose waves, colours ranging from deep brown and black to lighter browns, auburns, even shades we would call blonde. The DNA from these mummies, where it can be recovered, tells of complex ancestries, mixtures of lineages tied to ancient West Eurasian and steppe populations and to local East Asian groups. Silk Road before the Silk Road. But the hair alone, even before the genetics, was enough to disrupt simple stories. People once imagined ancient East Asia as uniformly straight-haired and dark-haired. The Tarim Basin mummies refuse that. They show that 3,500 years ago, in an inland desert far from any sea, there were populations with visible diversity in hair colour, and, from what we can see under magnification, a range of textures, from very straight strands to soft bends and possible waves. They are a reminder. Whatever the big genetic sweeps did, they did not steamroll variation flat. Even under strong selection, hair stayed plural. Turn west, and another archive of hair waits in the Nile Valley. Egyptian mummies hardly need introduction. What's easy to forget is just how much information about hair they quietly carry. Some bodies were embalmed with elaborate care, organs removed, resins poured, linens wrapped in layer upon layer. Others, especially common people in certain regions, were never formally mummified at all. They dried where they lay, in hot salty sand, their bodies naturally desiccated by the desert air. In both cases, hair often survived, sometimes in clusters, sometimes as full heads of braids, curls, or cropped styles. At a cemetery called Fag el Gamus, in the Fayoum oasis southwest of modern Cairo, archaeologists excavated thousands of these ordinary Roman-era burials dating from about the 1st to the 7th century CE. Most of the dead were not elites. They were farmers, labourers, families buried in simple cloth shrouds. Yet many of them still have hair. Analyses of those who do have preserved hair produced an unexpected result. Among that subset, a surprisingly high proportion, depending on how you categorize shades, more than half appeared blonde or red. If you extend light to include lighter browns, the fraction rises even higher, Some reports suggest that, in certain parts of the cemetery, graves with similar hair colours cluster together, as if people were being buried near kin who looked like them. It is an arresting image, a field of the dead along the Nile, where, under ancient linens, heads of dark hair lie beside heads of gold and copper. Immediately, questions bloom. Were these colours exactly the same in life, or did the chemistry of burial lighten originally darker hair? How representative are the preserved samples of the whole population? Did these people descend from centuries of mixing with Mediterranean and Near Eastern migrants? Or was such diversity already present, quietly woven into local North African lineages? There are no definitive answers yet. The Fagel-Gamus data are intriguing but contentious. Some researchers caution that we may be seeing a biased subset, altered by time. What matters for our story is that hair, as it survives, hints at complexity. Even in a single Egyptian cemetery, at a single historical moment, texture and colour refuse to align with any simple, one-tone picture. And that is just what we can see with the naked eye. Modern techniques are starting to pull more from these ancient strands and the bones beneath them. The first whole genome analysis of a 4,500-year-old Egyptian individual, a man buried in a pot during the Old Kingdom, has let geneticists reconstruct parts of his appearance from DNA alone, likely dark skin, brown eyes, dark brown hair. His ancestry seems to trace mainly to Neolithic North Africans, with a significant contribution from early farmers of the Fertile Crescent. Right now, for such ancient genomes, we can say more about pigmentation than about curl pattern. We can point to alleles associated with lighter or darker hair, with thicker or finer strands. We can look for familiar variants like EDAR370A, but the network of tiny genetic changes that collectively produce tight coils versus loose waves versus near-perfect straightness is still only partially mapped, even in living people. In ancient ones, with fragmented DNA and gaps in coverage, it is even harder. So the Egyptian genome offers us a proof of concept, not a finished portrait. It shows that in principle, we could link ancestry, visible traits, and hair type across millennia. In practice, we are just beginning. If we step back still further in time, even the Egyptians begin to look recent. In caves and rock shelters across southern China and Southeast Asia, archaeologists studying burials up to 10 or 12,000 years old have found something astonishing, evidence for deliberate smoke drying of human bodies. The dead were bound into tightly flexed positions and placed over low, smouldering fires. Heat and smoke gently cooked out moisture, turning living tissue into a kind of leather. In the oldest of these sites, only the skeletons remain. Any skin and hair they once had has long since broken down, yet the method itself, slow desiccation in a smoky, heated environment, is exactly the kind of process that, in younger examples and in ethnographic parallels, preserves hair amazingly well. If the interpretations are right, these could be among the earliest deliberate mummies anywhere, and for a time, years, decades, perhaps centuries after death, those smoke-dried bodies would have kept their hair straight, wavy, tightly curled. We don't know. The film reel has almost entirely burned away. We are left with the barest of clues, bones, charcoal, and a technique that implies a once-present head of hair. Put all of this together. The Tarim desert princess with her red-brown lashes, the Fayum commoners with their spectrum of light and dark, the smoke-dried foragers whose hair is now only an inference, and a pattern emerges. Not a complete picture. More like bright pinpricks across a dark screen. Hair enters the archaeological record in flashes. A burial in a salt-rimmed lake basin, a cemetery in the Nile floodplain, a high-altitude tomb in the Andes, a body pulled from an Irish bog with hair stained copper by peat acids. Each case offers a single data point. One person, one head, one moment. From these points, you can't reconstruct the full global history of curly versus straight. Not yet. You can't watch the gradual unspooling of the savanna helmet into waves in one region, dense sheets in another, elaborate braids and twists in a third. But you can see enough to know that diversity is not new. Long before modern nations and modern categories, there were people with light hair and dark, with thick shafts and fine, with strands that lay flat and strands that tended to curl. They were trading across deserts, farming in oases, hunting in forests, living and dying under climates very different from ours. Their hair weathered sun and wind and the hands of loved ones who washed it, combed it, plaited it, cut it for mourning, or adorned it for ritual. Then, by chance, a few of them were dried or frozen or buried just so, and the thread of keratin they carried wrapped itself around time and stayed. Those threads are what let us peek into the past with more than imagination. They anchor genetic models in physical reality. They remind us that when we talk about ancestral hair, we're not talking about a single look, but about a long branching experiment in which straight and curly, coarse and fine have been mixing and remixing for tens of thousands of years. To feel the human meaning of that experiment more fully, we have to go to a place where hair was not just preserved by accident, but crafted on purpose. A culture that turned wigs and braids and gels into art, and wrote its politics and ideals into every strand. For that we circle back to the Nile and step into ancient Egypt. Step into a courtyard in Thebes, sometime around 1400 BCE. The light is already harsh, bouncing off pale mud brick walls. The air is dry, the kind that clings to your throat. Flies are everywhere. Lice are a constant. Sweat is inevitable. Now imagine trying to live in this climate under a heavy cap of long, unwashed hair. The Egyptians solved that problem in a characteristically direct way. They cut it off. For many people, especially among the urban and the well-to-do, the default was not a flowing mane, but a shaved or closely cropped head. Men, women, even children might have their natural hair pared down for comfort and hygiene. If you get rid of the habitat, the lice have nowhere to live. In the heat of the Nile Valley, bare skin was easier to wash than dense hair, and a smooth scalp lets sweat evaporate more freely. But if you stop there, you miss the paradox. Because the same people who shaved their heads also poured enormous care into hair. They just moved it off the scalp and onto something they could control. Wigs in Egypt were not costume pieces in the modern sense. They were everyday technology, protective gear, status display, portable, customizable hair that you could put on in the morning, take off at night, and send to be cleaned or restyled without having to scrub your own skin raw. Some wigs were simple, short, practical, made from human hair or plant fibers twisted together. Others were feats of engineering, multiple layers, rows of braids or tight curls stitched into a base, decorative beads and coloured inlays threaded through the strands, gold caps on the ends of plaits, small cones of perfumed wax set on top so that, over the course of a banquet, fragrance would slowly melt down through the hairpiece. The quality of a wig told you who you were dealing with. Coarse wool or rough vegetable fibre suggested low status. Fine human hair, imported materials, inlaid stones, and complex braiding announce wealth and rank. Certain short, tightly curled Nubian wigs were associated with royal women and with connections to Nubia to the south. They imitated and perhaps idealized the tightly coiled textures seen on Nubian neighbors and allies. Priests, by contrast, were often shaved completely for ritual purity, stripping hair away during ceremonies as a sign of separation from ordinary life. Even the gods wore their politics in their hair. Deities could be recognized by signature styles. Hathor with her thick, heavy locks framing cow horns, child gods and royal children with the side lock of youth, a single plait hanging from an otherwise shaved head. To copy a divine hairstyle was to claim a kind of alignment with that god's power. Behind all of this was a simple but radical idea. Texture itself was something you could design. If you look across Egyptian art from different periods, you see a deliberate play of curls and straight lines. Some wigs fall like dark waterfalls, sleek and heavy, strands aligned to suggest straight or slightly waved hair. Others bristle with ringlets, short springy curls layered so thickly that they form rounded helmets around the face. The Nubian wigs favoured in parts of the New Kingdom are cropped close and tight, giving the impression of dense coils. In life, the people underneath those wigs would have had their own natural range of hair textures, just as any population today does. Some scalps probably grew tighter curls, others loose waves, others relatively straight strands. We see hints of that natural variety in preserved hair on mummies, and in the genetic diversity that ancient DNA is starting to reconstruct. But in the world of styling, that natural base was only the starting point. Merritt's wig makes this especially clear. Merritt lived in the 15th century BCE, married to Ka, an architect and overseer of works in Deir el-Medina. When their tomb was opened in modern times, her wig was still there. Centre-parted, composed of carefully arranged, slightly crimped strands that fall in a controlled curtain around where her shoulders would have been. Under a microscope, conservators could see that this hairpiece was not just a pile of loose fibres, it was an intentional texture. The strands had been smoothed, pressed together and fixed into place. Chemical analysis went a step further. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry of residues on the wig and on Merritt's combs picked up signatures of plant oils, plant gum, balsam and beeswax, and, mixed together, these ingredients would form a kind of ointment, soft at body temperature, then firming as it cooled. Exactly the kind of substance you could massage into hair, comb through, and use to tame stray fibres, define waves, and lock a style into place. In other words, a Bronze Age hair gel. This was not an isolated experiment. Texts, cosmetic jars and residues from other burials suggest a broader technology of unguents and pomades. Egyptians blended animal fats, plant oils, beeswax, aromatic resins and gums into stable mixtures that could gloss the skin, perfume the body, and shape hair and wigs. Change the brand names and the packaging, and the conceptual toolkit would be instantly recognizable in a modern salon. The point is not just that the chemistry was sophisticated, though it was. It is that this chemistry was being used to sculpt texture. Need your straight wig to lie perfectly flat along the jawline, work in more wax and oil, comb, press, and let it set. Want your ringlets to hold through a humid evening by the Nile. Coat them in a thin layer of scented balm and twist them tight as they dry. The difference between straight and curly in these cases is less an accident of genetics and more a matter of technique and product. Hair, in this world, was an interface between biology and culture. On one side, the follicles in people's scalps, quietly doing their evolutionary work, shaping strands according to the subtle curves of their roots, the distribution of keratin, the genes they had inherited. On the other side, a dense web of meanings, rules and expectations, which length and texture suited a scribe, a soldier, a priestess, a queen, which wig you could wear at court and which in a workshop, what it meant for a child to have their side lock cut off, how close your hair could come to divine iconography before it bordered on hubris. In between stood an industry, wig makers, perfumers, barbers, servants skilled in braiding and twisting and reattaching strands. They selected, sorted, stitched, glued and perfumed hair to meet those expectations. They were, in a literal sense, texture engineers. It is important to remember that most of our direct evidence comes from elites, from tombs with enough wealth to include wigs and pots of ointment, from wall paintings meant to project idealized images rather than casual portraits. Ordinary farmers and labourers left fewer traces. Their daily hairstyles and their natural textures are harder to recover. Almost certainly there was more variation than the polished art suggests. Even so, the record we do have is enough to show that by the time of the New Kingdom, hair in Egypt had become a language. Length, volume, curl pattern, and sheen worked like grammar and vocabulary, arranged into complex syntax to say things about class, age, ethnicity, ritual state. A short, tightly curled wig could nod toward Nubian styles and royal fashion. A smooth, long fall of hair might signal a different moment, a different role. Shaving entirely could speak of mourning, or purity, or temple service. If you zoom out, a pattern comes into focus. Along the Nile 3,000 years ago, people were not passively wearing whatever texture evolution handed them. They were shaving it off, braiding it back on, curling, straightening, waxing, perfuming, and ranking themselves by the results. They were taking a biological trait, one that had emerged over hundreds of thousands of years of climate, migration and selection, and turning it into social code and artistic medium. And while their specific styles are unique to their time and place, the underlying move is not. Egypt is one of the clearest early cases we can see, thanks to its desert preservation and elaborate burials. But it was not alone in attaching deep meaning to hair, or in treating curls and straightness as things to be created, borrowed, or erased as circumstances demanded. If we follow the thread outward from the Nile, across the Mediterranean to Greece and Rome, eastward into Persia and India, further still into China and Japan, we find other cultures doing their own versions of the same work. Different climates, different ancestries, different technologies. The same basic human impulse, to read identity off the head and to rewrite that identity strand by strand. From Merritt's beeswax-smoothed wig to a modern bottle of curl cream or straightening serum, the line is long but continuous. The science of why our hair grows coiled or straight is still incomplete. The chemistry of what we do with it has been evolving in human hands for a very long time. Leave the Nile behind for a moment. Sail north, past the Levantine coast, into the choppier waters of the Aegean. The air is cooler here. Different sun, a different wind, different mix of peoples after tens of thousands of years of migration and interbreeding. The hair is different too. In classical Greece, if you walked through a marketplace in Athens, you would have seen a spectrum of textures, just as you would in any city today. Waves, loose curls, straighter strands. Traders from farther north bringing lighter, often straighter hair. Visitors from Africa and the eastern Mediterranean with tighter curls and coils. But in the polished world of statues and poetry, the Greeks did something very specific with that variety. They idealized the curl. If you picture the standard Greek god or hero, chances are you're seeing thick, stylized locks, sculpted waves and ringlets, hair that falls in controlled curls over the forehead or springs back from a wreath. This is not an accident. Greek sculptors spent enormous time carving those twists and loops into marble. Texture was part of the ideal body, and it wasn't always natural. Archaeological finds and literary references tell us that Greek and later Roman women used heated metal rods, the calamistrum, as early curling irons. Hair would be wrapped around a hot bronze cylinder, sometimes protected by a metal tube, then set with oils or wax. Let it cool, and you had defined curls, even if your natural texture was closer to straight. The same tools could be used to tame natural curls into more regular, fashionable ringlets. Once again, biology provided a baseline, but technology drew the final pattern. By the time the Romans took center stage, the toolkit was even more elaborate. Roman women, especially in the imperial period, favoured towering constructions of curls and braids. Hairdressers, ornitresses were specialists, able to coax hair into layered waves, tight spirals, and intricate arrangements piled high on the crown. Calamistra heated over coals, pins, ribbons, and various unguents turned the raw material of the scalp into architecture. They also changed the colour. Roman writers mention bleaching and lightening hair with alkaline substances, lye, wood ash, and other caustic mixtures. These could strip pigment from darker hair, nudging it toward the blonde and reddish tones associated with northern European barbarians. At various points, especially under certain emperors, light hair became fashionable in the capital. One way to achieve it was to buy wigs made from the hair of enslaved northern women. Another was to chemically force your own hair toward that look. Texture and colour together became shorthand for identity. Roman authors like Tacitus loved to contrast the red and golden hair of Germanic peoples with the darker, often curlier hair of Mediterranean populations. They describe some foreign groups by their wild, uncombed locks, or tight, bristling curls, using those textures as symbols of untamed nature and supposed barbarism. In art, too, straight, smooth, carefully arranged hair tended to signal Romanitas. Romanness, civility, participation in the imperial order, while disordered or exaggeratedly curly styles could mark someone as other, exotic, outside. Of course, many people inside Rome had naturally curly hair. Many beyond its borders had straight. Reality was messy. The categories were not biological facts so much as visual codes, layered onto whatever genetics happened to produce. If you turn from the Mediterranean and look southeast toward the Indian subcontinent, the story shifts again. Here, hair was not only an aesthetic surface, it was a diagnostic tool. Early Ayurvedic texts, like the Karaka Samhita compiled roughly 2,000 years ago, discuss hair as part of a whole body system. Hair thickness, oiliness, tendency to dry out or frizz or thin. These were all read as expressions of deeper constitutions, the doses of Vata, Pitta and Kapha. Different textures in this framework called for different care. Ayurvedic physicians and later commentators prescribed Keshya Taila, hair-promoting oils, tailored not just to a generic scalp but to particular patterns. Sesame or coconut oil is a base, infused with herbs like bringraj for strength, amla for shine and to delay greying, brahmi for cooling and calm. Oiler, heavier mixes for people whose hair tended to be dry and brittle, often more tightly curled. Lighter formulas for those with finer, straighter strands prone to grease. Over centuries, these recipes multiplied and regionalized. Manuals and oral traditions recorded specific blends for coarser hair, for fine, flyaway hair, for premature greying, for breakage at the ends. Hair wasn't just hair. It was a visible index of internal balance, of health and temperament. To adjust its condition with oils and treatments was to adjust yourself. Caste, profession, and religious practice added more layers of meaning. There were expectations about how Brahmin men should wear their hair and top knots, how certain ascetics should let hair mat naturally into jata, dreaded locks, how married women of particular communities should braid or cover their hair. Texture interacted with these rules in practical ways. Tightly curling hair mats differently than straight, heavy hair. Some oils weigh down waves into something like straightness, others encourage curl. The scalp became another surface on which social order and spiritual aspiration were written. Move farther east again, and a different ideal comes into focus. Across much of East Asia, for large stretches of recorded history, the beauty standard was remarkably consistent. Long, straight, glossy black hair. That's not to say everyone had perfectly pin-straight strands. Even within populations carrying EDAR and other variants associated today with thicker, straighter hair, There is variation, waves, slight bends, differences in density. But in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean literature and art, the image that repeats is the same. Hair like poured ink, smooth and continuous. In Confucian thought, hair was literally not yours to dispose of. It was a gift from your parents, and to cut it without serious reason was a kind of disrespect. In Imperial China and in Joseon Korea, uncut, orderly hair signalled filial piety and social conformity. It was grown long, bound, braided, coiled, but rarely shorn. In Heian period Japan, court poetry praised women whose hair trailed to the floor, called kurakami, black hair, as a shorthand for allure. The strands were combed, oiled, smoothed, straightened as far as possible into a single dark sheet. Any natural waviness was, if not erased, then disciplined into the ideal. Precisely because hair carried this moral and aesthetic weight, changing it by force was explosive. When the Manchu rulers of Qing China imposed the queue, a shaved forehead with the remaining hair grown long and braided down the back, on Han Chinese men, it wasn't just a new haircut. It was a daily public sign of submission, stamped onto every head. Refusal could mean death. Compliance meant walking around with a hairstyle that many experienced as an affront to tradition and self. Centuries later, in Korea, reformers trying to modernize the state ordered men to cut off their traditional top knots. Again, hair change sparked riots and resistance. The physical act of cutting or rearranging strands was felt as an attack on identity, status, even spirituality. If we cross the Pacific now, or sail into the great island worlds of the Pacific and the Southern Oceans, the textures shift again, and so do the meanings. Among many indigenous peoples of the Americas, hair length, arrangement, and sometimes texture carried information about age, status, and life events. In some groups, cutting hair short was reserved for mourning, a visible sign of grief that could take years to grow out. In others, warrior status was expressed through specific braids, scalp locks, or adorned hairstyles. Uncut hair could be seen as a source of strength and spiritual power, a living connection to ancestors and land. In Polynesia, thick, often wavy or curly hair interacted with salt air, seawater, and local plants to produce distinctive styles. Bleaching with lime and sun, oiling with coconut, braiding and top-knotting created visual markers of rank and region. In parts of Melanesia, intricate bleaching and curling turned hair into luminous halos around the head, combining natural curl patterns with deliberate chemical alteration. On the Australian continent, Aboriginal peoples developed their own hair practices, including complex body adornments using hair belts and cords, and ritual cutting or singeing in particular ceremonies. Again and again, hair marked transition. From child to adult, from unmarried to married, from ordinary time to sacred time. If you stand back from all these vignettes, Greek curls carved in stone, Roman calamistra hissing in braziers, Ayurvedic physicians compounding oils, East Asian poets praising ink-black tresses, indigenous elders braiding hair for ceremony, a pattern emerges. Hair is almost never just hair. It is a text written on the body, a signal system. Texture is part of its alphabet. Tight coils, loose waves, pin-straight strands, each can be read, praised, disciplined, or stigmatized, depending on where and when you are. Some cultures try to accentuate curls, others strive to smooth them away. Some see uncut hair as sacred, others insist on shaving for purity. The same biological spiral of keratin can be romanticized in one context and condemned in another. What the biology gives us, the shape of the follicle, the distribution of keratin, the particular mix of genes like EDAR, TCHH, and many others, is raw material. a starting point shaped by millions of years of climate and chance and selection. What culture does with that material is something else entirely. Greece, Rome, India, East Asia, the Americas, Polynesia, Australia. Each took the inherited spectrum of human hair textures and turned it into social code, into caste markers and beauty ideals, into signs of conquest and resistance, mourning and joy, piety and rebellion. And this is where the mystery deepens, because to understand why some populations have more tightly coiled hair and others more straight, we need genetics and evolutionary theory. But to understand what those coils and straight strands have meant to individuals standing in front of mirrors, to empires passing laws, to communities in ceremony, we need history, anthropology, and a very human awareness of how quickly we turn biology into meaning. That habit of reading the person from the hair did not end in the ancient world. It followed ships and armies into the age of exploration and conquest, where hair texture would be drafted into an even harsher project, sorting, ranking, and ruling human beings by invented races. And there, the story of curls and straightness takes a darker turn. When European ships began to cross oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, they didn't just carry guns, germs, and trade goods. They carried eyes trained by a particular way of looking, a way that took the old habit of reading identity from hair and skin and clothing and hardened it into something much more rigid, race. On the decks of those ships and in the new colonies they carved out, European observers met people whose hair did not fit their homegrown expectations. Coils and kinks far tighter than most had seen, dense afros that refused to hang like European waves, textures that reacted differently to humidity, to oil, to combs. Instead of treating this as one more variation on an already broad human theme, they began to rank it. By the 18th century, as empires expanded and the Atlantic slave trade reached its horrific peak, hair had been folded into a full-blown theory of human difference. Naturalists and early anthropologists, men like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, set out to classify humanity the way they classified plants and animals. They looked at skulls, skin colour, facial features, and they looked at hair. In their diagrams and descriptions, straight hair became a marker of some so-called races, tight curls of others. Terms like woolly were used for afro-textured hair, as if it were an animal product rather than a human trait. Straight or smooth hair was attached to categories they placed nearer the top of their invented hierarchies. Wavy hair, often associated with what they called Caucasian, was treated as an in-between, conveniently matching the self-image of many Europeans at the time. These schemes were not neutral. They were built to justify existing power, colonization, enslavement, dispossession. If you could argue that some groups were naturally closer to animals because their hair was tight and springing rather than falling flat, you could claim that they were suited for hard labour, for servitude, for rule by others. If straightness was framed as a sign of refinement, then straight-haired Europeans could be cast as the pinnacle of civilization. Hair, which in deep time had been shaped by sun and climate and random mutation, was now being recruited into an entirely artificial story. In plantation societies from the Caribbean to Brazil to the American South, that story became day-to-day reality. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were graded informally and formally by how closely their appearance matched European norms. Skin tone, facial features, and hair texture all entered into cruel calculations of status. Looser curls or waves were sometimes read as evidence of European ancestry. People with those traits might receive slightly different treatment or find different niches in a rigid social order. Tightly coiled, densely packed hair was stigmatized as the far pole from whiteness. The closer hair came to straightness, the closer, it was said, a person came to civilized. This wasn't a truth about hair, it was a script written on top of it. By the 19th century, so-called race science had fully absorbed these scripts. Textbooks, lectures, and museum displays presented hair texture as a fixed biological marker of race. Charts laid out types: woolly hair for Negro races, straight for Mongolian, wavy for Caucasian. The language was often couched in the tone of cool description, but the rankings were clear. Tight curls went at the bottom. Once that hierarchy was in place, hair could be used not just for description, but for control. In apartheid South Africa, this became literal policy. When the white minority government formalized racial segregation after 1948, it needed ways to sort people into legal categories: white, colored, native. These labels determined where you could live, which schools your children could attend, what jobs you could hold. Families could be cut apart on paper and therefore in life. Hair became one of the tools. Officials developed what became infamous as the pencil test, a simple, almost absurd procedure. A pencil would be pushed into a person's hair, usually at the crown. If it slid out easily, that was taken as a sign of straighter hair, and the person might be classified as white. If the pencil stayed lodged, especially if it could be bounced without falling, the hair was judged too tightly curled. The person might be placed in the coloured or black category instead. Behind that small motion lay enormous consequences. A single strand's curl pattern could help determine which neighbourhood you were allowed to enter, whether your marriage would be legally recognised, whether your children could share a schoolyard. People with similar ancestry, and sometimes members of the same family, could end up in different boxes because of slight differences in texture. Hair, once shaped by genes like EDAR and TCHH, and countless others in response to long-ago climates, was now being used as a bureaucratic gate. The weaponization of hair did not stop with classification. It also took the form of forced change. In the United States, as the federal government set up boarding schools for Native American children in the 19th and early 20th centuries, hair was among the first things targeted. Children arriving from reservations often came with long braids, hair grown under cultural and spiritual rules that saw it as a connection to community, land, and ancestors. At the school gates, those braids were cut off. Hair was shorn short, styled in European fashions, sometimes treated with harsh soaps and tonics. The message was explicit. Your old self, your people's ways, are to be erased. Instructors banned indigenous languages, ceremonies, clothing. The motto, repeated in various forms, was chillingly clear. Kill the Indian, save the man. Cutting hair was both symbol and method, a daily reminder, visible in every mirror, that a child's body now belonged to an institution, not to their own community. Similar dynamics unfolded in other settler colonies. In Australia, during the period now known as the Stolen Generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were taken from their families and placed in missions and institutions. Again, hair was cut, European grooming standards enforced. Traditional styles, textures, and the meanings attached to them were treated as problems to be corrected. The assaults were not only physical, they were psychological, aimed at breaking continuity between generations, between individuals and their inherited ways of reading the body. And under all this ran another, quieter story: adaptation for survival. In societies that punished tightly coiled or afro-textured hair, people developed strategies to navigate those punishments. Some were overtly political, rejecting imposed standards. Others were more pragmatic, trying to reduce the daily friction of discrimination. Chemical relaxers, many of them lye-based, hot combs heated on stoves, various oils and pressing techniques. These became common in black communities across the Americas and beyond. Straightened hair could mean safer passage through certain spaces, easier access to jobs, less harassment in schools. It could be a way to step around the sharp edges of bias, even as it came at a cost to scalp health, time, money, and often self-image. Over decades, these practices built an entire economy. Today, textured hair consumers, especially black women, spend significantly more on hair care than many other groups. Some of that spending goes toward nurturing curls and coils. Some still goes toward altering them. The legacy of those earlier pressures lives on in product aisles and salon menus, in the sheer variety of tools designed to either coax curls out or flatten them down. In this sense, hair texture shifted from being a mostly invisible genetic detail to a crowded intersection of biology, history, and power. A trait with high heritability, shaped by follicle geometry and keratin cross-linking, was turned into a social credential, something you could be punished for showing or rewarded for masking. Laws, school rules, workplace policies, many of them, into the late 20th century and beyond, treated certain textures and styles as unprofessional, unclean, or inappropriate. And yet, precisely because hair was so policed, it also became a site of resistance. Under slavery, in colonized societies, and in modern cities, people braided messages into hair, preserved cultural patterns in secret, used styles as quiet codes of belonging. Later, natural hair movements would take that impulse and amplify it, explicitly challenging the idea that straightness was the norm and everything else a deviation. The story of colonialism and race science turned hair into a weapon, but it also eventually set the stage for people to pick that weapon up, turn it around, and use the same coils and kinks and waves as declarations of survival and self-definition. In the next part of this journey, we'll drift forward into that more recent past and present, into afros and locks and big chops, into boardrooms and schoolyards, into a global market trying to sell solutions to a problem that biology never actually posed. The problem was never curl versus straight. It was always what human beings chose to see in the curl. The first big crack in the straight, his best story didn't come from a lab. It came from a shape, a circle of hair. In the 1960s, in the United States, as civil rights protests filled streets and the Black Power movement gathered force, a new silhouette appeared in newspapers and on television screens, the afro. Not just any rounded style, but a deliberate, unapologetic halo of tightly coiled hair, grown out and shaped rather than pressed flat or chemically relaxed. It was, in one sense, just keratin and follicles doing what evolution had prepared them to do. In another sense, it was a manifesto you could see from across the room. For generations, black people in the Americas had been nudged, pressured, or outright forced toward Eurocentric grooming. Relaxers, hot combs, and strict good hair hierarchies had been woven into survival strategies under Jim Crow and colonial rule. Now, activists like Angela Davis and countless unnamed students, workers and parents chose the opposite. They let their coils expand into a visible refusal. The afro said, "This texture is not a defect." It said, "This is mine." In the wake of that first flourish, barbershops and salons became quiet laboratories of style and politics. Pick combs with raised fists at the handle, natural hair shows, photo spreads featuring dark skin and dense curls. All of these turned the head into a billboard for a new kind of pride. But movements, like hair, go through phases. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the huge afros of the previous decades receded a bit from the mainstream. Jerry curls, press and curls, and relaxers were heavily marketed. Corporate workplaces and television networks still often enforced neatness in ways that translated to straighter, smoother, less big. Chemical straightening was sold as modern, professional, manageable. Underneath, the old hierarchy of texture was still there, just better packaged. Then came another shift. In the late 1990s and especially the 2000s, a new version of the natural hair movement grew up, not just as protest, but as a kind of collective experiment. This time, instead of political pamphlets and campus rallies, the main tools were blogs, forums, and eventually social media. People began talking about the big chop, cutting off relaxed ends and letting new growth come in untouched. They traded recipes for shea butter mixes, argued the merits of sulfate-free shampoos, and devised routines with almost scientific names: LOC, LCO, wash and go. Curly-haired people from many backgrounds joined in. In the 2000s and 2010s, what became known as the curly girl method spread from one book title into a global online culture. Avoid sulfates, avoid silicones, don't brush hair dry, respect the curl pattern. It wasn't perfect science, and it didn't work for everyone, but it gave people who had grown up fighting their hair a new script. What if, instead of forcing straightness, you learned how your particular helix wanted to behave? By the 2020s, this had turned into an enormous, loosely connected online classroom. On YouTube, long, gentle videos showed how to detangle without breakage, how to define coils, how different products interacted with different textures. On Instagram and TikTok, close-up shots of spirals and kinks filled screens. Knowledge that had once lived mostly in family circles, black salons, and small community spaces was suddenly searchable, replayable, translatable into dozens of languages. Yet even as more people celebrated their natural texture, the older penalties had not entirely vanished. They were simply being named more clearly. In workplaces across the United States, studies commissioned for what would become the Crown Act documented what many already knew from lived experience. Black women were found to be roughly 1.5 times more likely to be sent home from work because of their hair. They were significantly more likely to be told about formal grooming policies, and far more likely, one survey put it at over 80%, to feel their appearance was judged more harshly than that of their peers. The bias often hid behind words like tidy, appropriate, or professional. Afros, braids, locks, twists, styles perfectly compatible with hygiene and competence, were treated as deviations, even violations, when similar volumes or lengths on straight hair passed without comment. Children were not exempt. News stories and court cases in the US and elsewhere described black boys and girls facing school suspensions, being excluded from sports or graduation ceremonies, or being told in early primary school that they could not wear their hair in locks, in braids with beads, in puffs. Some were asked to cut their hair to participate fully in school life. For a child of 5 or 6 whose sense of self is still knitting together, the message was clear. How your hair naturally grows is a problem. All of this pressure, some subtle, some brutally overt, eventually pushed lawmakers to act. In 2019, California passed a short bill with a long reach, the Crown Act. The name stood for Create a Respectful and Open Workplace for Natural Hair. On paper, it did something deceptively simple. It amended existing anti-discrimination law to explicitly include hair texture and protective styles, braids, locks, twists, and more, as traits linked to race. In other words, you could no longer pretend that punishing certain textures was just about dress code. Over the next few years, other US states and local jurisdictions adopted similar measures. A federal version of the Crown Act passed the House of Representatives in 2022, even if it has not yet become national law. Beyond the United States, some countries and cities began considering or enacting their own protections against appearance-based discrimination, including hair. The legal language was dry. The implications were not. For the first time in many places, the law was saying the curl itself cannot be grounds for penalty. While this legal story was unfolding, another quieter story was expanding in supermarkets and on bathroom shelves. the economics of texture. Because textured hair behaves differently, its curves slow the spread of sebum, making it drier and more fragile, its coils more prone to breakage. Caring for it often takes more time, more steps, and more products. Market analyses estimate that globally, consumers buying for textured hair, especially black women, spend significantly more on hair care than many other groups. In the United States alone, black consumers are estimated to spend over $1 billion each year on hair products. One industry report projects that the global black hair care market will reach many billions of dollars in the coming decade, growing steadily as brands multiply. Shelves that once offered perhaps one ethnic section now feature rows of bottles labelled curl-defining, coil cream, kink-friendly, 4C hydration. Large beauty conglomerates have launched dedicated texture lines. Smaller, often black-owned brands have innovated with ingredients long known in communities, shea, castor, aloe, while navigating the difficult path into major retail chains. Social media again acts as amplifier. More than 2/3 of consumers in some surveys say online content influences which textured hair products they buy. A single viral video showing a transformation from dry frizz to bouncy ringlets can empty store shelves. Influencers with tight coils and loose waves, with mixed textures and grey curls, all demonstrate their routines, reviewing gels, masks, diffusers. This is democratizing in one sense. A person with coily hair in a small town far from any specialized salon can watch someone with almost the same pattern break down step by step how to care for it. But there is a tension running through this new curl economy. The same channels that celebrate texture can also generate new anxieties. If you watch enough content, you may begin to feel that every curl must be perfectly clumped, that frizz is always failure, that you need a 12-step routine and a shelf full of products just to be acceptable. Marketing, even when it uses the language of empowerment, is still marketing. It benefits when people feel they are not quite finished, not quite enough without one more purchase. So we arrive at a paradox. In law, on many screens, and in some workplaces and schools, natural curls, coils, and waves are more visible and more protected than they have been in centuries. Yet the same systems that once insisted hair be straight now sell endless solutions for fixing or enhancing the very textures they belatedly celebrate. From one angle, that looks like progress tangled with profit. From another, it looks remarkably familiar, because if you step back to the beginning of our story, to ancient Egypt with its wigs and perfumed resins, to early farmers twisting and braiding hair with whatever tools they had, you see a pattern as old as civilization itself. Humans have always styled hair. We have always oiled it, bound it, straightened it, curled it, shaved it, extended it. We have always read meaning into it and argued over what that meaning should be. What has changed across time is not the basic biology of keratin and follicles. What has changed is the script we write onto those strands, which textures we reward, which we punish, which we naturalize, and which we medicalize or market. Today's natural hair movements and curly economies are just the latest chapter in that long braided narrative, a chapter in which people are pushing, in courts and comment sections and classrooms, to uncouple a simple physical trait, a shape that emerges as hair grows from an asymmetric follicle, from centuries of hierarchy. The science, as we've seen, still doesn't fully explain why some of us have tight coils and others pin-straight strands. The genes involved are many. Their history is complex. But in living rooms and legislatures, on scalps and in statutes, another kind of knowledge is crystallizing. Whatever the evolutionary reason, curl and straight are both just solutions that bodies found to old environmental puzzles. What we do with them now is up to us. In the next part of this journey, we'll step back again from the salons and courtrooms and look into the microscopes and data sets, into what researchers are only beginning to uncover about the genetics, physics, and evolution of hair texture, and all the mysteries that remain unsolved. So we arrive here at the edge of the map. We've walked through deserts and ice ages, through barbershops and burial grounds, and it might feel as if the story of curly versus straight hair should be wrapping up neatly now, as if some final answer is waiting. This gene did it, at this moment in prehistory, for this very specific reason. But when you get close to the science, the neat outline starts to blur. On paper, hair texture looks like it should be simple, straight, wavy, curly, coily. A tidy little gradient you can label with a few numbers and letters. In reality, it's one of the most stubbornly complicated traits geneticists work with. We do know a few of the main players, variants in a gene called EDAR, a link to very straight, thick hair in many East Asian and some Native American populations. Another gene, TCHAH, trichohyalin, helps explain some of the difference between straighter and curlier hair in Europeans. Other names show up again and again in studies, WNT10A, some keratin genes, regions of DNA that keep flickering in and out of statistical significance. But then you look at what it takes to actually predict a person's hair. Consumer genetics companies, the ones that cheerfully tell you whether your ancestors might have had freckles or detached earlobes, now offer hair type predictions. Behind the friendly app screens, their algorithms are using not 5 genes, not 10, but thousands of markers scattered across the genome. Ancestry DNA, for example, says it draws on more than 2,000 separate DNA sites to estimate whether your hair tends to be straight or curly. And even with all that information, the prediction is just that, an educated guess. The numbers, when you talk to researchers, are almost humbling. Twin and family studies suggest that hair curliness is highly heritable, often estimated around 85 to 95%. Yet the specific variants we've identified so far explain only a modest fraction of the full range of curls and coils that actually appear on human heads. Most of the genetic influence is still somewhere out there, in combinations of tiny effects, in rare variants that haven't been sampled yet, in interactions between genes that we barely know how to model. In other words, one of the most obvious differences between people, something you can see from across a street or a classroom, is driven by genetic patterns we can only partially map. The mystery runs deeper when you try to put hair on a timeline. If you open a textbook, you might find a simple story. Early modern humans in Africa had tightly coiled hair, well suited to hot, open environments. Later, as some populations moved into colder regions, straighter, thicker hair evolved to trap heat. The EDAR variant that's common in East Asia and the Americas arises, spreads, and there you are. A global gradient from coils to pin straight. But when dermatologists and evolutionary biologists look closely at the data, the story refuses to lock into place. Recent work suggests that tightly curled, relatively long scalp hair probably did characterize early anatomically modern humans, roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. It makes sense, a kind of built-in sunshade, a halo that lets heat escape from the scalp while still shielding skin from the harshest rays. The trouble comes when you ask, then what happened? Exactly when did different regional textures, looser curls in some places, waves and pin-straight hair in others, start to diverge from that baseline? How fast did those changes spread? Were they driven mainly by climate, by chance, by cultural preferences? The answer for now is, we don't really know. Fossils hardly ever preserve hair. Rock remembers bone, not ringlets. A few mummies give us snapshots from the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, but they're like random still frames cut from a very long film. Genetic models that try to date particular alleles, like the thick hair EDAR variant, come back with wide ranges, tens of thousands of years, give or take many more thousands. Each new ancient genome nudges the estimates one way or another. The deep history of texture, the exact roots and rhythms by which coils and straight strands spread across continents, is still more of a sketch than a map. One of the most promising tools for filling in that sketch is something that didn't exist until very recently: ancient DNA. A few decades ago, sequencing the genome of a single living person was an international moonshot. Now, as techniques improve and costs fall, researchers are quietly doing something even stranger. They're reaching into graves of permafrost and old museum collections, extracting fragments of DNA from bones and teeth, and reassembling those fragments into genomes. From those genomes they are starting to infer appearance. This field, sometimes called DNA phenotyping, has already had some success with colour. We can often estimate whether a particular ancient person had light or dark skin, blue or brown eyes, lighter or darker hair pigment. It's still approximate, but it's getting better. Texture is harder, the genes are more numerous, their effects more scattered. So far, most phenotype reconstructions of ancient individuals say things like likely dark-haired or probably light-skinned, and then stop. The exact curl pattern, the difference between a loose wave and a tight coil, remains largely out of reach. Researchers hope that will change. As more ancient genomes are sequenced from Africa, Europe, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, and as we learn more about the full network of genes that influence curl, it may become possible to look at the DNA of a 10,000-year-old skeleton and say, with some confidence, this person's hair was tightly coiled, that one's fell in loose spirals, this group's hair was very straight. If that day comes, the global history of texture won't just be a story we tell from climate models and modern variation. It will be something we can watch unfold, population by population, across time. Even then, though, we may never get a single satisfying why. The farther scientists look into the evolution of hair texture, the more they see overlapping forces at work. Thermoregulation, tightly curled hair shading the scalp in blistering sun, very straight, thick hair helping trap warmth in bitter cold. UV protection, hair as a barrier against radiation in regions with intense sunlight. Pleiotropy, genes like EDAR that don't specialize in hair alone but affect sweat glands, teeth, and aspects of facial shape all at once, so that selection on one trait tugs the others along for the ride. Sexual selection, beauty standards and mate preferences that, over many generations, might gently tip the genetic scales towards certain textures in some communities. Genetic drift, sheer chance, especially in small, isolated populations, amplifying whatever textures happen to be there already. When you add all of this together, you don't get a single arrow pointing to a single cause. You get a tangle of arrows, crossing and recrossing over hundreds of thousands of years. A pattern where the same texture might arise for different reasons in different places, and where similar environments might end up with somewhat different hair because of quirks of history. The desire for a simple explanation, coils for heat, straight for cold, runs into the messy reality of evolution. The mysteries are not only ancient, they live in modern bodies too. Talk to dermatologists and endocrinologists, and they'll tell you something. People with curly hair have always known intuitively. Hormones change hair. Puberty thickens and darkens it. Pregnancy can make it lush, then cause it to shed. Menopause can thin it. Thyroid problems can make it brittle or sparse. Gender-affirming hormone therapy can reshape growth patterns across the body. And sometimes, texture itself shifts. There are countless stories of straight hair becoming wavy after pregnancy, of curls loosening with age, of waves tightening into spirals after a major hormonal change. The phenomenon is real enough that it appears in medical reviews as a clinical observation. Yet when you ask, What exactly is happening in the follicle to make that curve change? The trail goes faint. We know that sex hormones and thyroid hormones can influence the length of the growth phase, the size of the follicle, the number of hairs in a given area. But the fine-grained molecular explanation for why a follicle that once produced straight hair might begin producing a curl, the shift in cell behavior, in keratin cross-linking, in follicle asymmetry, remains largely speculative. The day-to-day experience of many people, looking in the mirror and realizing that their hair has quietly become a different shape, is ahead of the textbooks. For scientists, this makes hair an intriguing model system. It sits in that sweet spot, visible enough that anyone can notice it, heritable enough that you can trace it through families, complex enough that no single gene tells the whole story, and culturally loaded enough that people care deeply about it. In classrooms, hair texture is now a go-to example when teaching polygenic traits, those influenced by many genes, each with small effects. In consumer genetics, companies emphasize hair in their trait reports because it's an intuitive way to explain additive genetic effects and gene-environment interactions. Why two people with similar ancestries can still have very different hair, and why humidity, heat, and care routines can reveal or obscure patterns written in DNA. Researchers, meanwhile, use hair to test methods for studying how multiple genes work together, how selection shapes traits over time, and how social forces may feed back into biology by influencing who has children with whom. It's a surprisingly powerful lens, and yet, when you pull back at the end of all this, a quieter realization settles in. One of the most visible things about us, this thread that frames our faces, that we cut and braid and dye and argue about, is still one of the least fully understood aspects of our biology. We can split atoms, edit genomes, send probes past the edge of the solar system. But if you ask science to tell you in precise detail why your particular head carries coils while another carries straight sheets of hair, exactly when that difference emerged in your lineage, exactly how your hormones might reshape that pattern over your lifetime, the answers will be partial, tentative, and full of "we're not sure yet." In a way, that uncertainty is its own kind of comfort. It means the human body, familiar as it seems, still holds surprises, that the everyday, washing your hair, watching it dry into waves or shrink into coils, is, in some quiet sense, participation in an unsolved puzzle that stretches back through deserts and ice, through mummies and migrations, through ancestors whose names we will never know. It means that the thread running from their scalps to yours is not fully mapped, not fully explained. It is still being traced, strand by strand, in labs and libraries and living rooms. And as with so many parts of being human, the deeper you look, the more you realize. The mystery was never just out there in the stars or buried deep in the earth. It was also growing, all along, from the follicles just above your brow. So let's come back, slowly, to where we started. To you, maybe lying in the dark, one hand resting in your own hair, feeling the weight of it against the pillow, the way it falls or the way it springs back, the familiar pattern you've seen in every mirror every morning for as long as you can remember. On the surface, nothing could be more ordinary, but by now you know that it isn't ordinary at all. Inside each strand is a story that refuses to stay small, a story that begins in deep time with early humans under a brutal sun, when tightly coiled hair may have worked like a living sunshade, limiting heat gain and shielding vulnerable skin. A story that diverges as some of our ancestors walked into cooler skies and different winds, where very straight, thick hair may have helped it keep warmth in, or simply rode along as genes like EDAR-shaped sweat glands, teeth and faces all at once. From there it spreads out across the map, across Africa, where tightly coiled, spiraled and wavy textures form a spectrum so broad that almost any modern category system feels clumsy. Across Europe and the Middle East, where loose waves and corkscrew curls and pin-straight strands have been mixing and remixing for tens of thousands of years. Across Asia and the Americas, where the thick straight hair stereotype hides real variation, and where EDAR variants tell only part of the story. Tonight, if you tried to imagine some global average hair type, you would probably give up. Surveys suggest that when you group together wavy, curly and coily hair, something like 2/3 of people on Earth have what marketers now call textured hair. Straight is not the quiet default. It's just one point along a crowded line, and even that line is an illusion of simplicity. Twin studies say curliness is highly genetic. More than 80% of the variation we see is tied to inherited differences. But those differences are scattered across thousands of places in the genome. A few big players, EDAR, FGFR2, TCHH, stand out. Yet medical genetics still has to admit that many additional genes are involved. The same gentle wave can arise through different combinations of variants in different families, different regions, different histories. So when you run your fingers through your own hair, you're touching the outcome of an experiment that has been running for hundreds of thousands of years. An experiment with rules we only partly understand. And the story is not just biological. It passes through Egyptian tombs, where perfumed gels smoothed wigs into straight sheets one day and coaxed them into perfect curls the next. Through Roman streets and Greek sculptures, through dynastic courts in China and kingdoms along the Niger, where ideals of beauty rose and fell and looped back on themselves. Through centuries of colonial rules and race science that tried to turn texture into a hierarchy, ranking coils and kinks below straighter strands. It runs forward into salons and barbershops and bathrooms today, where people with textured hair, now recognized as a global majority rather than a niche, pour time, money and care into keeping their strands healthy in a world that still often assumes the opposite pattern is normal. All of that layered into something you can twist around a finger. Curly versus straight begins to look less like a simple split and more like a woven band. Climate and chance, genes and hormones, desire and prejudice, ancient migrations and modern markets, all twisting together into a spectrum that can't be captured by a single chart or a single explanation. If you were hoping for a final verdict, for science to step in and say, here is exactly why your hair looks the way it does, the honest answer, for now, is that we're still some distance from that shore, and that's not a failure. In a quiet way, it's an invitation. Every gap in the story, the missing fossils, the unmapped gene networks, the unexplained texture shifts after puberty or pregnancy or age, is a doorway left open. A reminder that the human body has not finished telling us what it can do, or how it came to be the way it is. The mystery is not an error in the system. It is part of what makes the system beautiful. It means that somewhere, right now, a researcher at a lab bench, or at a computer, is tracing another tiny piece of the pattern, connecting an ancient genome from a windswept burial ground to living populations, testing how curled wigs change heat flow under artificial sunlight, searching for the small variants that together turn a straight shaft into a spiral. And it means that you, simply by existing, by having the particular hair you have, are part of the data, part of the evidence that this ancient, unfinished story is still unfolding. If you've enjoyed drifting through that story tonight, from deserts and ice ages to mummies and modern salons, and you'd like to help this channel keep making these long, slow journeys into the past, a gentle favour. Tapping like, leaving a comment or subscribing really does make a difference. If you feel awake enough, you can tell me where you're listening from right now, a city, a country, or just under a heavy blanket somewhere. I always love seeing how far these threads travel. And if you'd like to support the channel a little more, there is also a YouTube membership option. It's completely optional and always quietly appreciated. For now, though, you don't have to do anything at all. You can just lie there, feeling the fabric under your head, the air on your scalp, the quiet presence of your own hair. Straight, wavy, curly, coily, whatever it happens to be tonight. Somewhere behind that texture are ancestors whose hair shielded them from sun or cold, people who tied it up for work or ceremony, who passed down the genes that would, much later, shape the way your reflection looks back at you. People whose names have vanished, but whose choices and chances still whisper through your follicles. Wherever you are, you carry a small living piece of that vast tangled history, a thread that connects deserts and ice fields, kingdoms and ships, laboratories and living rooms, all the way to this quiet moment. Let it rest with you now. Let the questions linger without needing to solve them. And as you drift towards sleep, know that the story woven into every strand will still be there in the morning, carrying its ancient, unfinished music just above your brow. Good night.